A black cat sits in the rain. It's pouring down like a bucket. Her fur is soaked. She could have found a shelter to keep from getting wet, but she sits there anyway. We're hearing announcements across the city. Weather service is warning of heavy rainfall of high danger category. We need to stay calm. Large drops were hitting the window awning. I couldn't remember a time when the city had been so flooded. In the midst of all this slushy gloom, a warm, bright light shone outside the windows. On the front door hangs a neat wooden sign with a beautiful inscription open. Even in such inclement weather, people are working. A gloved hand gently picked up the book and ran a finger along the spine. It is noteworthy that the gloves are white. You can see the amount of dust on the books and not to dirty the book itself. Very convenient. Carefully take the book from the shelf with a smooth movement. Make sure not to damage the edges or the binding. The young man looks at the book with one corner of his eye and says to himself in a half voice that it's raining heavily and there's hardly any time to wait for visitors. Although then he smiles to himself, looking at this book, which he took out with his hand. Maybe someone will come to his bookstore on purpose and bring an umbrella with him, or someone will be looking for a place to shelter from the rain. A young guy starts praising himself and talking about how good he is. If you don't praise yourself, the other guy won't jump up. In front of the bookcase was a table on which stood a kettle with hot tea and a cup. He hoped that such a good attitude and enthusiasm would bring him more customers, which in turn would make him more sales and replenish his coffers. The moon in this rainy sky today is simply marvelous, mysterious and full of power and strength. Suddenly there was a swing of the sword blade with a splash and drops of blood, which swiftly sliced through the air. Watching from above, there were two men standing in the alley. One of them is on his feet and frozen. The other, sword in hand, has already struck, and is behind him. The girl gracefully swung her sword, and behind her, one masked opponent with a bald head was left without an arm. The other was wounded in the stomach. New enemies come at her swiftly, throwing daggers at her, cleaving the air in flight with their blades. The enemies keep coming. Seeing this with her gaze, she quickly analyzes her actions and those of her opponent. She dodges the threat and counterattacks, dodging the trajectory of the daggers flying at her. Suddenly, she releases a bright red beam from her right hand. This bright beam pierces through the head of one of the opponents. He drops his weapon, and the other doesn't realize what's happening. In the last moment of his life, he saw that the bright beam appeared to be a sliding, flexible link sword in his partner's head. He realized with horror that graceful hands with metal claws had encircled his head. They coiled around her like black snakes, very tight. The girl looked at her victim like a predator with red eyes. And then there was a crunch of vertebrae. She just sneaked up from behind and snapped her opponent's neck. Final blow. The enemy falls to the rainy ground, and she left behind a pile of corpses. She won the fight, but the wound was in her right leg. The blood slowly dripped down her clothes and fell on the rain-wet ground. As soon as the blood reached the wet ground, a hissing sound was heard, as if acid was vaporizing, or the water cooled the hot metal. The girl thought to herself, looking at her bloody hand, "It's over, it's not a big deal if a few ribs are broken. She's alive." Gathering her flexible link sword in her hands into a cane, she thought about where to find shelter as quickly as possible. It would take at least an hour to recover. Despite the effects of the tainted blood, she would be defenseless for that period of time. She would need a place to wait it out, she thought to herself as she walked down the rainy alley. Behind her lay a pile of mutilated corpses, their blood spreading on the paving stones. She was indeed a skilled fighter. So skillful in dealing with her opponents that even their corpse faces bore a deathly, indescribable horror. Suddenly a soft glow caught her eye. In the midst of the rainy, dark city streets, she saw him as a light, as a beacon of warmth and comfort. She saw the glowing window of the bookstore. It was warm and dry inside, and the view from the street was very inviting. In this inclement weather, one wanted to be cozy. She started walking towards the bookstore. After all, it was the only one open nearby, such a pleasant and unexpected coincidence. Her wound was bleeding and she tried to keep her hand on it, thinking to herself whether or not there was a trap waiting for her inside. Her wound began to heal. The blood had stopped. The only thing visible was the torn areas of her clothes. Glancing with her gaze at the glowing window of the bookstore, but realized there was no choice. Touching the front door of the bookstore with her hand, she looked for a place to hide and told herself mentally to open the door. The doors swung open and the bell rang softly. The bell rang softly, but just enough to tell the bookstore owner that a new visitor had arrived. The drenched girl stepped inside the store, leaning on her cane. She tried to walk straight without showing her injury. Her gait gave away the clatter of iron-lined shoes. There was soft yellow light everywhere. You could smell the paper. It was warm and cozy. In front of a large rack of books, a young man of pleasant appearance stood at a book table reading a book. The owner of the bookstore. The young man smiled at his visitor and said hello, holding a book in his hands. He looked closely at the new visitor and mentally rejoiced himself. There was a reason he had waited so long. His expectations had paid off. The new guest was beautiful. He was scrutinizing her. Everywhere he looked at her. This visitor was full of stories. I'll have to use my sales skills, the bookstore owner thought. Or still with his talking and tongue-twisting skills. The young guy, in offering her a seat, said that if his guest was cold, she could use a towel to keep warm. The girl looked suspiciously at the towel. He's been waiting for me for so long? Yes, indeed. Here is everything I need. But there's a catch. This is no ordinary store, and this young man knows something. She took a warm towel in her hands and started to dry herself, thanked the young man, but said she didn't need to get warm. And wondering where he's from. What faction he belongs to. Maybe it's the Secret Tower or the Truth Society. Maybe it's the man from the Pueblos party. Though the young fellow smiled complacently and tried to be attentive and polite. She looked at him and realized that everything was very complicated. Holding onto her cane, the girl asked the bookstore owner. After all, he had been waiting for her all this time. Sitting across from her, he said that yes, it really is some kind of miracle. Two unknowns in the same place. Glancing at her, he added that he noticed she was in a tricky position right now. She is not a little girl and realizes that saying problems are nothing. Everyone has problems, and this kind of talk is a way to influence. She agreed with him and replied that indeed the situation is not easy. Mr. Lin starts pelting her with sweet and subtle speeches. His gaze became sly. The girl looks at the young guy and decides to play along. She doesn't fully understand yet whether he is her friend or her enemy, so she talks about her problems. Taking the teapot carefully in his hands, the shopkeeper tells the young girl that he is sorry. Pouring hot tea into his cup, he remarks that the problem is the relationship if he gets it right. He keeps pouring water and talking vaguely. Good skill for a salesman. A universal technique of dumbing down. There should always be room for maneuver and speculation for both yourself and your opponent. The girl got suspicious. She began to think to herself, he probably already knows everything and is trying to confuse me. Taking the back of the chair, he pushes it back on itself a little, and he bids her sit down with his whole appearance. Sit down and discuss the girl's problem, if she's willing to do so. She stares at the shopkeeper in disbelief, thoughts flying through her mind. To find out about the White Wolf rising so quickly. He can't be guessing like that. It's unreal. So he knows everything. She sits down at the table. She picks up a cup of tea and says she's been set up, left alone with her grief. She's looking at her reflection in a cup of tea, blaming one guy for all her troubles. The egg of a magical creature and a mirror can cloud all minds. How sad. Years of friendship erased by the lust for profit. Human greed. For his purposes, he used the resources of the organization and sadly began to kill former friends. A nightmare and a horror. Mr. Lin's brain almost melted from such a thing. He thought to himself that he might not be able to handle such a drama. But maybe the right medicine should be found for such problems. Holding a cup of tea, Mr. Lin reassures his guest that not everyone is a traitor around, and there are two sides to everything. Without taking her eyes off the reflection in the tea, the girl realized that sooner or later everything would be the same. People are always driven by their greed. The scenario hasn't changed. She confirmed to him that he was right. But the price of betrayal is very high, and she paid a heavy price for it. It seriously hurt her. She saw the worst in a man. All the dirtiest ugly things. There's no good in it. Mr. Lin, with his eyes closed, sat pensive. It all makes sense now. She had been emotionally traumatized by the bastard who had allegedly seduced her and then cheated on her, and she had suffered a lot. So delay is not worth the moment. Perfect Mr. Lin is a master of eloquence. He starts telling his guests that there are positives and negatives to everything. Looking deeply at the girl, the young man begins to realize that she now knows what is real and what is false. There is no pity for those who seek to do harm. Even if this person was once very close, I don't need to be afraid to hurt him if he wanted to hurt you. The girl is surprised and begins to understand the background. She wonders what his purpose is. Is he trying to devise some plan against the hunters? Very cunning of him. And elegant. After gathering her thoughts, the girl concludes that her interlocutor, who tries to pass himself off as a simple bookstore owner, is actually a powerful dark magician. So she asks him what her next move is. Looking at the girl with a snake's gaze, Mr. Lin tells her that since they are common scum, it is necessary to get even with them. You need to keep the visitor to make him a sensible offer given his circumstances, and the offer should be very different from anything else she might be offered. He told her not to be condescending to them. The girl looks at him with frightened eyes and says that does she really have to turn her back on them? She is not ready for this at all. Something's certainly not going according to plan, Mr. Lin thinks. But no matter, it's almost a done deal. It seems to him. He points to the book and says that this girl just needs it. Holding the binding with one hand, the shopkeeper thought as he read the title of her confession. The book itself was far from easy for a confused girl like this one. The book is inscribed with blood and beast. First time hearing that name, I wonder why he decided to give it to me now. It bothered the girl a lot. She feels like she's opening a page of a book, and it's soaked in blood. The symbols on the pages burn bright red. Suddenly, she finds herself in the mouth of a predator with hundreds of teeth, knee-deep in blood. She's sucked deeper and deeper. Then she is completely naked, and bloody tentacles envelop her from head to toe. She cannot resist, and is completely restrained on her arms and legs. A bloody glow rises. A star of crimson begins to shine. You can see the reflection of the wolf. The transformation is underway. It cannot be stopped. The beast of prey is breaking free. A giant eye appears, shrouded in a bloody mist. A red glow pierces it from all sides. And it all starts with an ordinary teacup standing on a book table. The girl is in for a bit of a shock. The girl's imagination, of course, is excellent. She slams this book down with the idea of turning into a wild beast is a power, but it is obtained and controlled only by blood. Hunters come from tainted blood, but the power itself comes from fantasy beasts. And then she sees a giant wolf's maw in front of which a syringe appears. Hugging the book, the girl further delves into her thoughts. The higher the concentration of tainted blood, the greater the strength of the hunter, but also the greater the degree of transformation into a beast. However, this man has come up with an idea to control the tainted blood itself. But how, she can't guess. The idea itself is insidious and elegant, and it's enough to tear down the order and power that the entire hunting community relies on. So she asks the bookstore owner. That's what he wants her to do. Mr. Lin stands erect proudly, a warm yellow light falls on him, and he tells her yes, he really needs the girl to do this, for her to be honest with herself. Looking at her, Mr. Lin realizes that even a woman who is too strong, if she is broken, she is still actually sad. The girl clutches the book tightly to her, and he mentally notes that just a few words of simple advice, and his guest is about to cry. He gently touched his hand to her shoulder and decided to use the original text from the book she was holding to somehow cheer her up and boost her confidence. Mr. Lin begins to quote, "Soon the beginning of the day of judgment will be approaching with the sound of trumpets, and we will stand before our Father with this book in our hands." It sounded very effective, and the girl began to look at the bookstore owner with confidence. In his hands he holds a red-bound book with the title Confessions. At the moment, the girl feels like he's getting inside her head, and is playing with her thoughts like some kind of toy or amusement. He looks at the girl and shows her that she shouldn't worry. Calming people is his gift and specialty. Every man has his dark animal desires, and it's hard to disagree with that. You have to accept it as part of who you are, and then a whole new stage of life will begin. And so he acts according to the scheme of the final stages to give the visitor competent instructions. The girl is tense and maintains an awkward silence, but Mr. Sloth has given her a boost of confidence that she can independently solve those problems she faced. Then he introduces himself as a clever little professor and the lesson is over, hoping that everyone who needs it has written it down. And then Mr. Lin raises his teacup like a wine glass and says, smiling, "Let's drink to our new future." The girl smilingly thanks the shopkeeper for the advice, and she will definitely use it. She started to drink the tea quickly, but she burned herself. It's boiling water, not room temperature. Smiling Mr. Sloth was happy for her with his warm words. He wanted to warm her up from the inside. Well, she really did well, and was able to come to her senses. The shopkeeper looks at his visitor from all angles. He realizes she is fine, although it may be due to the power of the legendary skeleton. He hands her a sheet he places beside her on the book table and asks her to fill out a library card. She's a little embarrassed, or maybe she burned her lips with boiling hot tea. She's filling out a library card. Her handwriting is beautiful. Taking the card in his hand, he reads the name of the visitor, Ji Jikshui. He immediately executed a famous resource development tycoon. It can't be, but that seems to be the name of the magnate's only daughter, thought the bookstore owner. Mr. Line's face froze in thought, and suddenly he thought to himself, what a visitor. What luck. You can spin it at home for money, the possibilities are great. But first you have to renovate your store. He mentally reassures himself the best way to make money is to make a regular income. He says the book is borrowed for 1 month with a maximum delay of a week. With an obliging look, he holds out an umbrella to her so she won't get wet. Then when she returns the book, she returns the umbrella with the book. Ji Jikshui takes the umbrella and thanks Mr. Lin for his help. She asks what the bookstore owner's full name is. She wanted to get to know him better. Maybe the owner overdid it, and his words sounded like a definite flirt, although it's hard not to fall in love with her. And he replied that his name was Lin Ji, just a bookstore owner. Opening the door, the girl thought he didn't want to reveal his true identity right now. Well, at least he's not her enemy at the moment. As she left, she opened her umbrella with an edge of her eye and said goodbye. In turn, Lin Ji waved her hand and told her to take care of herself. He would wait for the next meeting. He threw his hands up and was very happy. Doing good deeds every day makes you feel better and better, and today can be put in the piggy bank of good deeds. Perhaps that was the feeling meant by the strange creature that made me cross over into this world, thought the Linsei. So the young man thought he should put everything in order and get ready for the next visitor. Lightning flashed over the bookstore, and for a moment everything was illuminated. A girl under an umbrella, leaning calmly on a cane, goes strolling down a rainy alley. Ji Jixue is in a great mood, thinking about Mr. Lin that he's a really strange guy. We need to get rid of the traitor as soon as possible, and then return to the bookstore. Then she saw an angry dark figure in front of her, a ghostly silhouette wearing a hat. She gripped her cane tightly with her hand, and braced herself for something inevitable. The dark silhouette of the stranger was approaching. He too had an umbrella, a tattered cloak with ragged edges and a high-brimmed hat, and the clawed hand with which he clutched the book. The area of Nozin, Continent Azir. The night was particularly rainy and the moon was partially obscured by rain clouds. In the bookstore, Linji was going through his books as he always did. One of them he stumbled upon by accident. It's called Rituals in Magic, the author of which he is, in fact, himself. He opened it in the middle and ran his finger across the page. He remembered the scent of paper and the sound of a book page turning. There's nothing to compare it to, and impossible to forget. He looks at it from side to side and smiles to himself. This book is impossible to forget. Nostalgia is a strong feeling. After the transition in this world, he settled in the city of Nozin, and has been here for 3 years now. University Library. Linji is a doctor of folklore and a linguist, carefully going through the book pages. He is looking at each line with his glasses. A young girl of beautiful appearance asks him that he will still be in the library because it is time to close. In response, he waves her off and tells her to go about her business, and he'll read for a little while longer and then close it up himself. She thanked him with a cheerful look and said goodbye to him until tomorrow and said she was leaving. Meeting her friend, she apologized to her for the delay. The friend asks her Professor Linji if he's still busy and if he's not going to leave the library yet. The girl winks at her friend and says that the teacher loves to read. He spends almost his entire salary on books he collects. Linji goes to the shelf and is about to put the book back, but he hears voices as if someone is saying something that is not true, joking or exaggerating. He sighs. The body has finished everything he needs. He reads the book and puts it back in its proper place. Now we can go home, but first we have to check everything and close it properly. The rain is gone, the moon is high in the sky, it's clear and full. There's not a cloud in sight and the moonlight floods all around. Linji opens the door lock and enters the library, and he sees a huge energy pentagram above the bookcases in the middle of the library. It shines and illuminates everything around him. He walks into the very center and realizes that nothing comes true by magic. The ritual is complete. He is determined, he is unwavering and willing to pay any price if there is even one chance / even one single glimmer of hope. He puts his hand on the floor, and energy starts pouring out in all directions. Concentrating to himself, he repeats the wish he asks for all the books of the world he can find. Pentagrams gain energy begins to spark all around. Linji remains silent. Something black like tar appears behind him. Linji doesn't see it, and he thought that the ritual didn't work as usual. This made him sad. Unfortunately, he repeats to himself that the doubt was in him. Nonsense. Some magic circle didn't grant him his wish, and behind him a whole monster with teeth that look like a worm has already grown. Suddenly he heard his breathing and froze in horror, petrified. He couldn't move. After a moment he turns his head and looks. A golden eye appears before him, which was the lock for the purple doors with bloody patterns. At this moment, Linji realized that by opening this door, he would get what he wanted, what he asked for, but the price he would never return to Earth again. And smiling, he says he's willing to pay for it. He needs it, he craves it, and he's not going to pay the price. Reaching forward, he opens the door, and a bright yellow light shines through the gap that appears. His one-way journey had begun. He sits at the table or with a cup of tea, and remembers that once he passed through this door, he ended up in Nozin. Sitting at the book table, leafing through a newspaper and drinking tea, he thinks that time is running so fast. He has been here for so long, and his present life is no different from his previous one. Looking at the page of the newspaper, he continues his musings that the ritual must be paid for. Everything has to be paid for. But he doesn't have any strange weirdo visitors, so he doesn't go at all slowly. Imagines himself as a little painted boy sitting at a small table and enjoying his cup of tea, saying to himself that it's wonderful there are still lots of books to read and chatting with the new guests who have stopped by the bookstore. It doesn't matter how many days you have in your life. It matters how much life you have in your days. Happiness is in the little things. You just have to be able to see them and enjoy everything. Pensive, he said in a half-voiced voice. It's been a while since he's had any guests in the bookstore, but his social skills were still good, which was a good thing. As he exhales, he remembers his last visitor, that sweet, charming girl. He sincerely hopes she'll be happy, if only for a little while, even if only a little happier. Ji Jixue looked forward fearfully. Raindrops were dripping down her face. The dark, ominous silhouette of the stranger was reflected in her eyes. It grew larger and larger, and the stranger came closer and closer. At last she could see in the dark moonlight the stranger approaching. He looked really ominous, and one of his hands was bound and holding some kind of book. He slowly approached Ji Jixue. I got in line with her. Didn't say a word, moved on. Ji Jixue was simply petrified and out of breath. This had never happened to her before. It's like a cramp has seized her and she can't move at the moment. And the hand on the cane froze, as if it wasn't her hand at all and didn't belong to her. The stranger took 2 steps away from her and looked at the book that Ji Jixue was holding in her hands. Smiling wickedly, he said she was very lucky. The book is excellent. It's a great choice. After his words, Ji Jixue imagined a huge snake with ruby eyes wrapped around her body, squeezing harder and harder, preventing her from breathing. She couldn't just move. She barely managed to shift her gaze toward the stranger, but that was the most she could do. Looking at the title of the stranger's book, she saw the inscription Void and Silence. She began to let go and control of her body returned to her. Her legs gave out and the umbrella fell from her hands to the ground. She dropped it. The rain continued to fall. Leaning her back against the wall, she began to slide down it, horrified to imagine who it could be, how this was possible. And I saw him heading to the bookstore. He walked to the door of the bookstore and opened it. The doorbell rang softly and not loudly, but it was clearly audible that a new guest had arrived. Linji greeted the guest. The latter, in turn, touched the brim of his hat with his hand. The young man was excited to see his buddy Frank most likely came to return the book. The stranger smiled viciously as he stood in front of Linji wearing a black mask. Their verbal duel is introduced. Frank asks how dare he say his name. The young man says he can easily do so. Frank says he saw a new visitor with a book he likes very much. Mr. Lin thought he should give it to her to read for a while, but it's not for everyone. It's too complicated for individuals. The glowing bookstore window was watched by Ji Jixue. Then, resting her hand against the wall, she concluded that the stranger brought out to her was the dark magician, the destructive Frank Wilde. She recognized him. According to the generally accepted rules of the year 1788, all supernatural beings lend themselves to the classification of abnormal, frightening, destructive, and indescribable. Frank Wilde is black, faceless, and the dark magician is destructive. His main characteristic is the black mask on his face, and dark green eyes like a big snake. The Secret Tower faction has put a good bounty on his head. One of the best fighters of this faction went into battle with Frank. The result was the destruction of an area of incredible proportions. And after this incident, he moved to the destructive level. There are less than 10 creatures of Frank's caliber in Nozine itself. There are less than 100 in the entire continent of Azir. Ji Jixue sighed. She felt sick and pushed her hand against the wall. It was so bad that it cracked. Thought to herself that how nice it was to chat with such a powerful supernatural being. She reached for her umbrella to pick it up off the wet ground. Covering herself with the umbrella, Ji Jixue slowly went on her way again, realizing that she had stumbled upon a very unusual person. Without taking his eyes off the books, Linji noticed that Frank was in a bad mood. He said that if he needed help, he should not hesitate to ask for it. After all, Wilde is already coming here out of habit. It is understandable that every old man wants attention and decent company. He is lonely because other mages dislike him. Lovers all leave him, and he has 2 children with whom he cannot find a common language. Looking at Frank sitting at the table drinking tea, Linji remembers how they met almost 2 years ago. It was the same weather, rainy as it was now. The door opened leisurely inside the bookstore. As always, the bell rang with a soft sound. Linji stood behind the book counter and greeted his new visitor. Looking at the new guest, he quickly realized that he has wealth. But since he hides his face, he seems to be a loner. While adjusting his glasses, Linji thinks that this is his great chance to get a regular paying customer. One must take his time to be careful. Frank asked Linji if this was his store, and whether he could turn in old books that might be of interest to collectors. Linji said that it was possible, but one had to wait a little longer. The weather is rainy damp, so the young man offered his new visitor a cup of tea to bond a little. Frank then said his face was terrible and he didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Linji replied to him that one should look at the contents, not the wrapper. Foolish people always judge only by appearances. Besides, he shouldn't be afraid because he was a guest in this bookstore. After looking at the young man, the old man remained silent for a while. His snake eyes scrutinized Linji carefully. Then Frank told the store owner that he was pretty smart. He took off his outer clothing and said to be polite and be grateful for a good welcome and hot tea. Linji smiled and thought for a moment. Frank's face is not really scary, but rather strange. Looking closely, the young lad realizes that the old man is hiding the old scars with his mask. You shouldn't pry into someone else's past. The young man began to look at the book the old man had brought him. And judging by this book, the old man is a highly qualified linguist, so this is the place to start. Frank left the cup on the table and thanked Linji for the tea. The young guy said he didn't need a thank you, and pointed out that the books Frank had brought described very rare languages and dead ones too. Smiling, Linji said in a half-smile. One could sense the magic between the lines. Frank was very surprised at his words. His snake eyes rounded even more. How is that possible? All traces have been meticulously wiped away. There's nothing to be found. There can't be a single hint of magic. Frank thought about how Linji was being calm, so carefree. He doesn't feel any energy aura, but he's clearly a complicated man, not just a bookstore owner. He said he dabbles a little in language research as a hobby, asked Linji to give him some advice. The young man immediately answered him that he was not exactly an expert in linguistics. He is, however, familiar with research in related fields, and he could recommend a couple of good books. The only thing worse than physical loneliness is spiritual loneliness. He gives Frank a book labeled Wenzo dialect. It's a new direction. It's the most difficult dialect. Professional linguists cannot understand it and call it the language of the devil. The teacup fell to the floor and shattered. Frank looked at the book and just froze. And all around him there seemed to be an emerald glow, and the book showed its fangs. Frank gathers his thoughts and thinks about what to say to the bookstore owner. Then he says affirmatively that coal is the language of the devil, so be it. Looking at the book, he confirms that yes, it is him. In his imagination, the book begins to fly above him and a green emerald glow flickers around him. Linji praises himself and says that he did everything right. Frank asks him in amazement how he got the book. After all, it is very rare. And then Linji hesitated. He doesn't know what to say. He can't tell the truth either. Well, at least he can say one thing. Linji confirmed that it was the language of one of the oldest civilizations. It was widespread during its heyday. For a moment, a thought flashed through his mind, unfortunately. He remembered home. And again he remembered that he couldn't go back. Never. Frank, listening intently and watching him repeated about civilization, some nostalgic tone in this young man. Leaning one hand on the book table, the destruction mage reasoned. This guy seemed to have something to do with this civilization, and how scary this civilization was. Looking closely at the bookstore owner, he saw a black and purple glow around him. He wondered what kind of creepy creature he was. But the guy suddenly interrupted his musings and asked his name. His name is Frank Wilde, the old man replied. He kept his position discreetly to himself. He asked the name of the bookstore owner. Linji was approached by Frank with some questions. More recently, he has encountered certain difficulties in his research. Thanks to that devil language he lent Frank 2 years earlier, he was able to find a new direction, but he needs other sources and more information. It's a joke Frank didn't get. The Devil's Tongue wasn't a serious title. It's just a funny nickname. Linji asked Frank that he wanted to take something new from the same area. About 40 years ago, it's winter. A bird sits on a tree branch and chirps. There is snow all around and mountains can be seen in the distance. Frank Wilde's joyful and youthful face is simply radiant. He stands on the stone ledge opposite the Titan with the crown. The Titan opens his mouth to draw in air. Prepare to cast the spell. Casts an incantation loudly. Die, that is the power of the magician. Frank turns back in horror. He sees a just singing bird dropping dead. Titan tells Frank that mages manipulate spells. Language and writing power. Light magicians compose spells and write them, and dark magicians hear. The Titan was chained to his throne. He had a crown on his head. He told Frank that after becoming a dark wizard, while you seek to find your way to your own soul and hear its voice, you have to create your own language, which will help you find the path to the level of God. In a frightful frenzy, Frank smiled. How long ago it was. Frank sat at the table and remembered pictures of the past. Linji asked Frank what kind of book he wanted this time. Probably the same area of the same genre, Frank told him. That he wanted a different book because the other one was a little hard for him. It was a dialect of another language, and it had a lot to do with cultural practices. He needed to understand the hidden meaning. Linji thought to himself and replied, he would need some time to find something suitable. Frank sat quietly at the book table sipping hot black tea. He collapsed in his chair, enjoying the drink and the warmth and light of the bookstore. Thinking to himself that as always Mr. Lin was generous and unselfish. 2 years ago, Frank had a very serious fight with Joseph in which he lost his entire left arm. And when Frank went astray, Linji would always help him and guide him. Frank noticed that the young lad was capable of picking up the rarest of books and completely hide his aura from him. As a wizard of destructive levels, Linji is, as Frank notes, supposed to be a serious scholarly hermit, but his power goes far beyond divine capabilities. 2 years passed. Frank was able to approach the field of researching forbidden spells, which was based on the knowledge from the book given to him by Linji. Frank sat at the table and looked at the bookstore owner. All thanks to this well-read scholar. His knowledge is great. This time I really want to thank him for real. Lin Ji is reaching for a book called Rituals and Magic, of which he is the author. Then he turns to Frank and apologizes to him for the delay, holding the book he'd taken from the shelf for him. He holds out this book to the Wizard Destroyer, saying perhaps he's being overly presumptuous, but he thinks this book to Frank is quite fitting. Frank reverently stretches his arms toward her. Lin Ji says with a smart look that he is confident about this study. The knowledge collected in this book is true. Frank picks up this book and holds it up to him and realizes that the author of this book is Lin Ji. It is both surprising and a little frightening to him. The young man smilingly says that it is so trifling. He is very ashamed of this insignificant composition and writing. Frank holds the book in his hands and realizes it's too sudden for him. He has seen a lot of all sorts of religions in this world. The Moon Cult, the High Mist Wall Cult, the Truth of Knowledge Cult, all of which he knows well. He's never heard of a corpse eater. It's the first time he's ever seen one. And the energy is so evil, the writer's obviously not a good person. Maybe he's going to start his own cults, or his own religion. And then Frank asks Lin Ji about what his area of study is. And he's into rituals. Is that right? Lin Ji replies to Frank that yes, indeed it is. He is doing his research in this area. It is the field that changed his destiny. The owner of the bookstore asked me not to remember it. It was a long time ago. Frank looked at him and his eyes narrowed, which meant a long time ago. What do you mean, changed destiny? He didn't understand. Now it's beginning to dawn on the Destroyer Mage. A scholar who follows forbidden topics has immense power, doomed to be excluded from the mainstream community of any religion, which is why this young man leads a reclusive lifestyle. Frank holds the book in his hand, drawing attention to the fact that the binding of the book seems to be handmade. Lin Ji replied to the magician that due to unfortunate circumstances, it was not possible to publish it. So he only kept the version that was made by his own hand. It's a shame Mr. Lin was transported here permanently and irrevocably. This book would have earned him a degree. Mac Destroyer stared at the bookstore owner's tense hand, keeping his eyes on her. Lin Ji told Frank that because they had the same interests, he would let him read the book for a while. But if there was no trust, Lin Ji could recommend another book. Frank tensed up a little. His mind was full of all sorts of thoughts right now. He thanked the young man for his generosity and said that he was honored to read such works. Frank, sitting at the table, held the book up to him and said it was a one-of-a-kind book, most likely a very painstaking work. Did Lin Ji really believe the grumpy old man so much that he was willing to put such an important thing in his hands? Handing over such a large value to his use really bothered him. It made him feel kind of uncomfortable. Frank thought that the young man wanted to do some kind of experiment on him. Lin Ji bowed to his guest. He was very pleased at his politeness. He found out that the book was a single copy and was afraid to lend it, as he considered it very valuable. But nothing, the doubts of the dear guest, can be dispelled. He calmly patted the old man's shoulder with his hand, and then went on to say that there was no need to be alarmed. After all, his research only has value when people need it, when people use it and notice it. Lin Ji told Frank that he could definitely add more value to the book himself. Reaching my hand forward, the young man says he's no longer concerned, and it doesn't matter to him that this book is the only copy. He stands in the middle of the bookstore looking at all these huge racks of books and says that today he owns a whole valuable book collection. Lin Ji tells Frank that he can easily make a copy at any time. Knowledge cannot be stolen. Only fame and fortune can be stolen. Knowledge is the true value. The young man made a satisfied look and tries to explain to the mogul that weak wealth is dust to him. It doesn't matter. The Destroyer Mage almost fell off the chair he was sitting on. After what he had heard, there was no limit to his surprise. Smiling slyly, Lin Ji mentally repeated to Frank to take this value. This book, this is his last opportunity. The young man saw right through it. Frank's loneliness is destroying him. He's an old man abandoned by everyone. So he chases fame and fortune. He needs to compensate for the emptiness in his soul. Well, that kind of thinking can have painful consequences. It would be bad for his health. That's why Lin Ji is giving him this chance. A chance to be closer to the crowd and feel some semblance of care. In his mind, he asks the Dark Mage again if he understands him, and if he accepts his gift. Frank takes the book with his hand and cradles it in his. Frank thought to himself that in this way he had been warned against divulging secret knowledge to others. He thanked the young man for his advice. Lin Ji said that he didn't mind at all if he decided to recommend this book to someone else, even the opposite. Frank said he understood and would do his best. After thinking to himself, Frank concludes that this is the price to be paid. Mr. Lin would like his work and knowledge to be disseminated. He puts the book carefully in his pocket, but not to reveal the identity of the owner of this book, and not to disseminate its contents in detail, putting a hat on his head. It seemed that Frank was the only one the bookstore owner trusted to study this book, inside and out. and then, in a general way, to communicate its essence to those who wish to read it. It is imperative to be careful, once again careful. Frank thanked Linji for his guidance and excellent advice. As a gift, he did the following. The dark mage opened an interdimensional portal and stuck his hand into it. And in an instant, a statue of a fearsome gargoyle emerged from the portal. Frank apologized in advance if this gift upset the young master. Linji carefully looked at the statues, asking if it was a gargoyle. Frank Wilde said that it was not of much value and would not repay Mr. Lin's help. But he asked fervently to accept the gift as a token of his favor. This gargoyle is Frank's work from his school days, and the teacher who taught Frank rated it very highly. The gargoyle has sufficient magical resistance and protective skin, extremely sharp claws and fangs. But most importantly, it instantly recognizes killing intent. In terms of combat power, she was no inferior to elite warriors. Mage Destroyer wasn't lying. Linji held the gargoyle in his hands and admired it, but it seemed a little shy. Frank told him that it was of little value. The work was very graceful, like the real thing. Even though it was expensive, this is a true token of favor. But if it's a token of Frank's appreciation, he's decided to accept it. The gargoyle can be used to ward off evil spirits. It's close to the stone that repels evil. The young guy thanked Frank and said the artwork was exquisite to his taste. Can't wait for some other interesting gift from him next time. Frank replied that he was quite touched that he liked the gift. He thought to himself that it was only one gargoyle of frightening level. But the value of the book he had gotten was enough to create tens of millions of gargoyles like this. Yes, Mr. Lin's manner is merciful. He deliberately expressed his praise and contentment so as not to offend the dark mage. Leaving, Frank told Linji he had to go. He had to go. By next time, he would be sure to prepare an interesting gift for the young master. I really hope he will be satisfied. The mage's snake eyes narrowed. The next time's gift should be valuable enough to reach a truly divine level. Linji smilingly said that he was looking forward to seeing him and would be happy to meet him. Frank made his gesture of farewell and withdrew. There is a closed sign on the door of the bookstore. The young boy looks at the gargoyle and remains silent. Suddenly he wonders if maybe next time Frank will give another gargoyle, but it will be a female, so that Linji could have a pair. I wonder if gargoyles have males and females. It would be nice to know. The gargoyle has very exquisite red horns and a nice mask. The work is really done masterfully. Every detail is visible. Mr. Lin looks at her and says to himself approvingly, well, the energy is flowing and the strength is contained perfectly. He's pulling up next, a little tired from the day. He's almost done for the day. Yes, keeping your mind clear does make it easier to attract luck to your side. And he walked over to the book table and saw a large black stain spreading across the surface. At first I did not pay attention, but then I realized that it was not a stain at all, but a thick, oily black mass similar to fuel oil. He looks at the table in horror and he seems to realize who it is. His eyes are scrutinizing the stain and his pupils are constricted. An inscription forms from the stain. Long time no see. Linji realizes that this is the same monster that sent him from his home dimension to here with the reward of a bookstore. Could it really be him? Black fat began to spread frighteningly across the table. It was moving up and down in different directions. Linji asked incredulously if it was you. He looked at her with a focused gaze and thought that's what was behind my transport to this world. Calmly exhaling, he catches you thinking that after only 3 years and he's reappeared. Calmly sitting down in his chair, the bookstore owner says, since he has shown up, it is time to pay the full price. He asks him to tell him what needs to be done, and then Linji will have to fulfill everything. But he begins to wonder if the creature that helped him did what the young man asked. Maybe it's some kind god. But what is the price? Does it have to be exorbitant? And then his gaze was attracted by the stirring of an active black substance. He looked at the table and saw an inscription formed that said the Dizu had awakened and had already begun his quest. It was like a shot had been fired from a gun into his head. Could it be because he let Frank recommend a book he'd given him to someone? Affirmative answer, yes. Linji says out loud, so this is the price. This is what is required to do. Getting other people to recommend to distribute this book. Linji looked focused on the table and asked the substance whether it would benefit her. Affirmative answer, yes. The young man was pleased. Then there's no problem. He'll do what he can. No questions asked. And in the same instant, the black substance disappeared from the table, as if it didn't exist, as if it had simply evaporated like a drop of water in the sunlight. Linji wondered what it could be. It's pouring rain. A mysterious figure in a purple cloak stands looking down on the city. The figure's name is Jack. He's looking for Frank Wilde. He's suspected of being involved in a hunting ring. A number was recently found on the street. Besides, said Jack, he'd been in the bookstore for about an hour. Maybe it's a special gathering place for dark magicians. There's a woman on the other end of the radio. She's ordering Jack to preserve his intelligence. She orders him to go back and detail everything he saw, later to be reported to the teacher Joseph. Jack replied that he understood. Behind Jack appears the figure of Frank Wilde with the words, "Little rat, you've got guts." Jack is startled for a moment. Then he grabbed a dagger and tried to stab Frank with it, with a cry of wail. While Frank took him sharply by the side of his face and squeezed his skull, you could feel the crunch. The Destroyer Mage's snake eyes narrowed, and a terrible grin appeared on his teeth, and he uttered only one word, "Die." Jack's head exploded into pieces, and the body immediately collapsed to the ground. Death was instantaneous. There was a sound on the other side of the communicator, and someone's voice asking where Jack was and what happened. Frank just took it and crushed the communicator with his foot, stepped on it. Fixing his hat, he said that it was not worthwhile to venture into this man's house. Don't even have the thought of regretting dying. His evil snake eyes turned green. It was still raining like a bucket, and only on the first floor of the big building was the light on in the bookstore. I could see that the owner was there. A beautiful shiny plaque hangs on the good wood door. On it is engraved the inscription Intelligence Department of the Secret Tower. A young girl in a rush and wearing glasses runs up to this door and knocks on it. You can hear his voice from behind the door, asking the Lord Knight to please listen to the report of the abnormal case. The unaged man sighs and wipes his glasses. His almost gray beard is ungroomed, but thick. He took hold of the bridge of his nose with both hands and tells the young guy to call him Claude and let her in. The satisfied girl smilingly walked into the office. She waved to her colleague in the corridor. The Grand Knight immediately began to ask him what the matter was, Hunters, or if something had happened to the magic mirror egg. He rose from his desk and thought that he was really surrounded by a bunch of dumbasses who were good for nothing. He jumped up and slammed his metal hand against the table properly because of anger. Because all these idiots are preventing him from enjoying his retirement in peace. There are no professionals. Sooner or later, he'll start practicing boxing on their mother's tombstones. The table was smashed to the ground. Smoke came out. The guy correcting his glasses asked the teacher not to get angry, please, and turn his attention to the image. The Great Knight reached forward with a corrective hand and asked if Claude was afraid. He, exhaling with irritation, asked, "Didn't you close the door?" Claude was silent in response. Holding a notepad, Claude apologized and said that the situation was completely different. The Grand Knight clarified another situation in the sense of something new. Right now, there can't be any situation more important than a riot set up by those crazy dogs. The agent assigned to track the Hunter's movements was killed on 23rd Street. According to his report, he found out the location of Wilde's Wizard of Destruction before he died. The Grand Knight's mouth fell open in surprise. His face was filled with the emotion that, what the hell is going on here? A grin showed on his teeth, and the Grand Knight interjected. Claude repeated Frank Wilde's magician, the Faceless Destroyer. About 2 years ago, he disappeared after a battle in the hills with a large bounty on his head. Claude couldn't herself believe that he had survived then. In the past 2 years, only the Grand Knight had been sure that Frank had survived. The Great Knight rejoiced. He knows more than anyone about the mage's habits. It was good that he had finally crawled out of his hole. What luck to have her here in Nozen right under my nose. It seems his shriveled brain finally squeezed out some life-giving moisture. The Great Knight rejoiced and looked at his mechanical arm. Then he looked at Claude and asked what he was doing on 23rd Street. Claude answered quickly and promptly. The information received is rather limited from our agent Jack. It is assumed that Jack was killed by Wilde. It's known that Frank went into a very ordinary bookstore before the collision, and was there for over an hour either buying books or renting them. Again, the Grand Knight struck the table with a mechanical hand. A mage of destruction gains power by relying on language. Why would he buy books? It's impossible. The Great Knight looked at Claude and said that there was definitely something wrong with the store, and that it was urgent to check the background of the store. Claude answered fearfully that the bookstore has been in business for 3 years. The reputation is good. A small number of visitors. An ordinary bookstore is listed in the Ashlar Chamber of Commerce. Nothing out of the ordinary. Claude continued. The odd thing was that the owner of the bookstore was a foreigner. Of course, there were suspicions that it was some sort of meeting place for dark magicians. But right now, it's a little hard to believe. There's no proof yet. The Grand Knight asked her what she wasn't sure about. The Ash Chamber of Commerce. This is a community of light mage druids. They honor nature. It is unlikely they would have any dealings with a dark mage. Claude echoed that if you hurry, you could damage the reputation of the Chamber of Commerce. Druids are a touchy people who might start protesting against the secret tower. Hit the wall. The Grand Knight called the druids a miserable bunch of problem vegetarians. They're nothing but headaches. Claude looked at him and realized that the teacher must be wrong, because druids were not vegetarians. He turned sharply and looked at Claude, as if she had thought of something obscene. But she started to recoil with a stupid face. He quickly ran up to her. His shoes were fancy, but no socks. barefoot. He grabbed Claude by the scruff of the neck. You could see the rage in him, and Claude stood staring at him, frightened, and jumped in and asked his subordinate, "Does she know the knight's main task?" She answered him with frightened eyes that the main task was to keep the peace and establish darkness. "We cannot compromise. Otherwise, we will be like the darkness. No cooperation with accomplices." They stood in the middle of his huge office in front of his desk, and he was telling her all this. Wilde had been in that bookstore for over an hour. He wouldn't have spent that much time for nothing. Reading a book or idle chatter, that's not the reason. Tea singing, that's ridiculous. It doesn't even make sense. He explains in his sequence to Claude that the evil black magician would not waste his time on such nonsense. Well, if she so much as thinks he might be wasting his time, then her teacher will put on pointy shoes and actually personally kick her ass. Afraid for her ass, the student corrected her teacher. The Ash Chamber of Commerce gives 40% of the funds to the secret tower. It was as if a gun had been fired into the Grand Knight's head. He hesitated a little, not knowing what to say. An awkward moment of silence, two black silhouettes of his student teacher standing in the middle of the room. The Great Knight exhales heavily. He quickly takes his coat from the coat rack. He puts it on as he walks and tells Claude to make her forget everything. He'll go to 23rd Street personally. It's up to him to figure out what kind of bookstore this is. Claude bowed courteously to her teacher in agreement. The lights in the corridor went out. The Great Knight walked past the plaque with the names of the departments. Logistics Department, Combat Department, Cultivation Department, Intelligence Department. As he passed the young cadets, he said, "Good day, Knights," walking down a neon-lit hallway. The Grand Knight is greeted by everyone asking if he's doing well. If he's fed, not hungry. The tower was a majestic and terrifying sight. Lots of wires, cables, and tunnels. The Great Knight presses the button on the elevator. Reading the dossier, he descends to the floor he wants. Mr. Lin Ji's file, a neat photo card and lots of information. Date of birth, residence registration, number of properties. The Great Knight, aka Abraham Joseph, smiling evilly examines the dossier. He wants to find some discrepancy. He doesn't believe that everyone is completely clean. Suddenly, Joseph had a seizure. His body went into a spasm. He's barely on his feet, shaking. The hallucination overwhelms him. He doesn't know where to go. If he didn't hold onto the wall with his right hand, he'd fall. He tries to analyze his hallucinations or visions. He notices that time after time at the same time, it cannot be a coincidence. A sword appears in front of him in a bright purple glow, wrapped in strength, not might. Abraham Joseph felt like he was falling somewhere. It was as if the ground under his feet was splitting apart. He tries to hold on to something with his hand. Then he abruptly finds himself in the water and tentacles wrap around his arms and legs. Someone's drowning him. He sees various water monsters and monstrosities under the water on the sides. Some girl who looks like a dark elf girl grabs him underwater and holds him by the head, trying to drown him. A giant monster with 6 red eyes, like a predatory starfish, wrapped its tentacles around him and dragged him towards it. Joseph finally came to his senses. But he realized that none of this was true, that this vision was a hallucination. He's walking down a rainy night alley, telling himself he's back in reality. In his hand, he has a dossier on the bookstore owner Lin Ji, and it just turned into a paper wet rag. It looks like Joseph won't be able to make it to that bookstore today. No goddamn luck. And he looks at his right metal hand and thinks that when he received the Sword of Light, he received with it all the madness of the very first owner of the sword. He absorbed into himself. And all this is maddening. Only a very strong-hearted knight with an unshakable will can control this sword and curb its curse. Joseph didn't expect the backlash to be this fast. He just hasn't had time to find a successor. There still isn't one. Both funny and bitter. The great invincible knight is really nothing more than an elderly cripple now. Joseph continues to walk down the rainy alley. The rain keeps pouring down from the sky. A disfigured dead body, as if it were petrified, fell to the ground and its arms broke off, horrified with no eyes. Flashes of lightning illuminate the top floor of the building where the silhouette of a man in a long cloak can be seen. Harris says to himself that the unexpected activity that has started, it's really surprising. Looks like he underestimated the girl. Harris thought she wasn't as worthless as she might seem at first glance. She might very well be the second in command. We'll also have to see what his subordinates can do when faced with what's in store for them. You can hear the clatter of women's shoes on the ground, heels lined with iron. Ji Jixue stands in front of the burning building and stares at it with his cane. The flames have engulfed the building up to the roof. Ji Jixue calmly looks at the fire. She was once the second leader of the White Wolves. There were sounds of running from the back. 2 of them came at her with the intent to kill her. Die, you monster! From nowhere, a dagger popped out, a sharp black dagger on a chain, and he killed 2 of his attackers instantly. They didn't even have time to do anything. The girl stood still. Ji Jixue said hello to Max. There were pools of blood spreading out beside her. Max quickly reported to her that the enchanted egg was now in Harris's hands. He must have gone completely off the rails if he'd massacred the Hunters organization as soon as he'd taken possession of the egg. Holding onto the cane, Ji Jixue really confirmed Harris's insanity. Jumping down from above, Max warned her. He's afraid that humans aren't strong enough yet. Harris has teamed up with Kaji. This attack is suicidal. There will be no survivors. A soft female gate was heard. Kate, dragging the dead body of her opponent by the collar, says that Harry's has a powerful force now. Among all the White Wolves, his level is closest to the intimidating level, and Kaji has trained many hunters to self-organize. It makes sense that these two would team up against Miss. She thought to herself that my lady was facing betrayal because of some scoundrel who was looking for the man behind her back. Ji Jixue smiled, winked, and thanked Kate. If Kate hadn't switched clothes with Ji Jixue back then and held back the pursuers, Ji Jixue would never have broken free from the siege. Now she stands before Kate ready to fight the odds again. And it's all thanks to her. Without Kate, Ji Jixue herself wouldn't be alive. Kate became embarrassed and accepted Ji Jixue's praise. Milady is truly extraordinary, and she's unknowingly been able to suppress the effects of the tainted blood herself. Retained her sanity and didn't turn into a terrifying beast. Ji Jixue realized that in the state of an animal, intelligence and self-control were rapidly declining. It's not just a mystery, it's beyond the comprehension of all hunters. No one has ever done this before. A huge wolf grabbed its prey, a human body. She would recall that flawless white figure traveling through the fabric of time and space itself. It tracked and killed its enemies, just like God himself. And then we hear behind them a grin of teeth and an unpleasant voice, although Harris is very strong. But the fact that he's close to a frightening level really makes this boss incredibly intimidating. Ryan said that once Harris and Kaji transformed, they would be easy targets. He did have the look of a rat. Small, sneaky, cunning. Ji Jixue didn't like him, but she was well aware that people like Ryan were very much needed. At least he has the rune of loyalty on his soul. You can trust this one. Kate and Max will be able to resist the power of destroying the magic mirror egg, but it's all thanks to a rune from the Light Mage. He is under the patronage of the family. She realized that she had tainted blood in her, and this whole hunt for the ferocious beast was just pipe dreams. Max always and everywhere had my back. Kate didn't hesitate to protect my life while I retreated from my surroundings. Ryan, though a nasty sort, is quite useful and loyal. Without his information and skills, it would be impossible to win. Ji Jixue shifted her walking stick and turned it into a flexible sword with sections. Exclaimed the hunter that there was no turning back, and the hunt became already realized. All three looked at their leader and nodded approvingly. Kate wished her caution and good luck. Ryan remained suspiciously silent. His sly look is alarming. Ji Jixue shouts to the entire front three to come in. The doors to the church are shabby and old. They look pretty dilapidated. It wouldn't be any trouble at all to kick them in. 4 powerful, swift blows reminiscent of a steel blade passing through some wooden object, and the doors are blown to pieces, fall to the ground, and all 4 of them go inside the church. You can see a dark silhouette under the cross instead of the altar. In the darkness, it is hard to see who it could be. As they looked closer, they saw Kaji standing there. It was the 3rd head of the White Wolves. He was stabbed through with a battle scythe, the stalk that came out of his stomach. Kate yelled to him if he was alone, and started asking where Harris was. Kaji began to laugh. Black blood spurted from his mouth. Ji Jixue ran up to him and said that something was wrong. She saw and exclaimed in disbelief. She touched Kaji's shoulder, and a violent cracking sound was heard in his cervical vertebrae. His transformation into a wild beast had begun. Blood poured from his eyes, from his mouth, from his nose, just everywhere on his face. Ji Jixue quickly screamed and demanded an injection. Max pulled an injection from his pocket. Kate covered her mouth with her hands. The horror of it made her unable to hold back. Max tossed an injection syringe into Ji Jixue's hands. She immediately jammed the syringe into Kaji's heart, so much so that you could hear the chest crack. The injection began to take effect, and slowly began to reverse the transformation. Consciousness was returning to Kaji's eyes. He began to chuckle. Ji Jixue grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and started shaking him. She wanted to find out where Harris was now and where the magic mirror egg is. Suddenly, Kaji's teeth began to turn into fangs. The injections didn't work. The transformation into a beast continued. Blood was pouring from everywhere on his face. The only thing that made sense of what he said was that someone was coming. And then Kaji was torn to pieces. Blood spurted out in different directions. Ji Jixue was actually holding his scrambled hands, not realizing what had happened. She slammed her fist into the wall with annoyance and left a deep dent. Gross! Max advised Miss that you could go to the magician Haywood and ask his advice. He owed a debt to the family, and would not refuse to help. Ji Jixue said there was no need to do that, and ordered Kate to continue the search with Max. Kate agreed, and Max stood surprised and looked at his mistress. He didn't understand why she had rejected his advice. Ji Jixue added that Ryan should go with her. Ryan asked her again where he should go. There was insight and enlightenment in her eyes. For a moment, she had an answer to her questions. Ji Jixue replied that they were heading to the 23rd Street. There they would be able to find what they were looking for so hard. A cup of hot tea stood on the book table in front of the bookstore owner. A hot cup of tea stands on the table with steam coming from it. A hand in white gloves takes it by the handle. Lin Ji is sitting at a book table, drinking tea and reading a book. It can be seen through the storefront window on the front door hangs a sign that says, "Open. Another day without business." Strange young master thought lazily that 3 days had passed since Frank and Miss G had visited him, and still no one had stopped by to see him. Even though Lin Ji is in need now, he has almost no money. Barely enough for food. He owes a lot to that little black girl. She finances his store. An official business license and a temporary residence permit she gave him for nothing. Hopefully that book he recommended, Nonviolent Communication, will help her with her problems. School violence. It's just awful. The weather is not good today, Mr. Lin thought, and no visitors are expected. Cases like Miss G's are extremely rare. I heard the bell ring. He didn't immediately realize who it was. He automatically greeted the visitor. She was the pretty girl Miss G. She quietly walked in and slammed the bookstore doors behind her. She said hello to Lin Ji and apologized for disturbing her. She was very good looking, smelled nice and dressed nicely. For a second, Mr. Lin was simply stunned. He hadn't expected her to come. He shone like a sunshine and greeted her again. He was glad she'd come to see him again. Just a mention in the regular customers, and there he was. Could it be that Lin Ji's book business has started to gain momentum? Maybe thanks to this lady, Mr. Lin will prosper. She brings him luck. For all that, it's worth investing in his studies. He said it's nice for him, and the surprise meeting in just 3 days. Miss G is the first to return to the bookstore after such a short time. Ji Jixue thought that Mr. Sloth was very displeased with her. Her thoughts spoke of one thing, that he had given such good instructions for her, and she couldn't solve everything instantly. And halfway through she came for help again to his bookstore. Maybe, thought Miss G, she was the most worthless of his customers. Ji Jixue calmly looked at Lin Ji. Suddenly she saw a gargoyle on his desk that Frank had given her. It's very familiar to her, but even without the aura, it's very intimidating. Where did Mr. Lin get such a gift? A thought occurred to Ji Jixue. He must have discovered it while hiding under the guise of an ordinary person. And how will it help to calm her down, if she herself is as weak as a little child? I wonder if Mr. Lin will treat her as leniently as before. Some impudent thoughts crossed her mind. She apologizes to Mr. Lin for upsetting him. Ryan walks into the store and he asks her if this is where they were supposed to be. He stands a little discouraged. Bookstore or? And then he went into a stupor. He's looking at an ordinary man. How is it? Mr. Lin asked Ji Jixue who it was while looking at Ryan. Ji Jixue said that this is her subordinate, don't worry about him, he is loyal. Lin Ji thought to himself, what a miserable girl this girl is, surrounded by scum. He must have a loyalty mark. Just then, Lin Ji came up with another idea. If she had then taken revenge on that scumbag who had hurt her like Lin Ji had advised, then she wouldn't be so insecure now. Besides, for some reason, her saying the phrase upset you. Moving a cup of tea towards her, Mr. Lin asked her, had she failed miserably? Ji Jixue sitting quietly at the book table, reasoning to himself that most likely the shopkeeper already knows everything. Ji Jixue said she failed. Her opponent has escaped until now. She doesn't know where to look for him, and there are no clues. Even though she has sent someone to look for him, but there are no results. Her fight lasted exactly 2 days. She would have gotten big results, so much so that her opponent retreated each time. Just yesterday, after 5 hours of brutal combat, despite heavy losses, she was able to destroy her enemy's lair. But then she realized that her enemy was not him, and he abandoned his ally and fled. Now it seems that the girl underestimated the enemy could not be so smooth. She apologized to Lin Ji again for getting very carried away with her story. Lin Ji smiled affably and said that it was not her mistake to apologize. Then he took a sip of hot black tea from a cup. Generally cannot understand how this happened, that it is not a little lady turned the relationship into a real war merciless. Lin Ji remembered a good saying that love is very similar to a battlefield. Only in this case with this girl, love is the real battlefield. Perhaps Ji Jixue, in Mr. Lin's opinion, is used to using business terms, and the descriptions are kind of strange. Maybe she meant communicating with this scoundrel for 3 days if you take the wording simpler. And eventually she realized that this cunning scumbag found a good way to get away in advance, prepared to leave a friend of his alleged partner, and disappeared with the stolen money, Miss G. He calmly and leisurely pours tea from the teapot into a cup. Well, the picture is more or less coming together now. Lin Ji is beginning to understand. Miss Ji asks Mr. Lin what he even thinks about all of this. Ryan was covered in a cold, clammy sweat, probably from worry. He didn't know what to expect, what the outcome would be. He must have his nose to the grindstone. He gave up the location of the black, faceless, dark magician Frank Wilde. The information was classified. Whoever he was giving this information to was in need of it, and he didn't dare mistake its accuracy. He was praised as he should be praised. He alone had done what they could not. Although he liked to be flattered, Ryan was no fool. He said he was going to lay low for a while. If you need more information, have his CI contact him. He is advised to take the mark of fidelity as insurance, but no one knows if it can be easily removed. But it's the power of the mark that interests Ryan. Kate saw Ryan because she'd been looking for him for a long time. It was like they were playing hide and seek. That's where he hides. There's a reason he's nicknamed Mouse. Kate warned Ryan that Miss G was looking for him and told him to get ready to go, and reminded him of his manners and that he was Milady's servant. Ryan turned on the fool and started apologizing. In his head, he had his own plans and thoughts, the ability to control the transformation freely. If it was possible to get hold of this information, it would be possible to destroy any hunter organizations. With this information, even a sewer mouse could move the king of all beasts. He watched with a sly look, and on his neck burned a loyalty mark. No need to disappoint him. And now he's looking at Mr. Lin with fear. He feels as if this young man knows everything, all his secrets and sins. But he can't understand one thing. Why is Miss G so respectful to a mere mortal? A simple, seemingly human, as if she had encountered the strongest divine level. Miss G asked Lin Ji for help. Lin Ji told her that there was no need to worry, everything was much simpler than she thought. Right now, your enemy is not him. You can concentrate on something else. Fear is just fear. You have to wait for good news to appear. Bragging empty barrel ambiguity, as in Taijiquan. Ryan understood. He understood it all very well. It's ambiguity. It's all a common trick used by con artists he knows all too well. This man is a complete liar, a bullshitter. Lin Ji apologizes and asks you to give him time. He gets up from the book table and wants to retire to the restroom. Too much tea, he didn't think he'd have company, so he ran quickly to the toilet. Ryan and Miss G stared after him, and then Ryan starts lashing out at her and saying that even though she's the boss, she's doing something very stupid and unwise right now. But Ji Jixue rudely interrupted him. She called him insolent and already regretted bringing him along. No manners, no politeness, no manners. Mouse was just mad as hell. Manners. He started yelling that the shopkeeper was a blatant liar. Yes, his manners are unfamiliar to him, as well as his upbringing, but he is very familiar with deception, and he is really an expert at it. At least he can cite a few people who do it as well as Lin Ji. It's just that Ryan doesn't want to see Miss G get tricked again. And then she brought her sword to his throat and sharply told him to bite his tongue. Ji Jixue was furious. She told Ryan that if he wasn't useful to her, she'd kill him right now. There's nothing but contempt in the arrogant man's eyes. Mouse quickly realized that his patroness was very easy to manipulate. She's a naive girl. It's really easy to spin her around. All you have to do is divert her attention, and it's all in the hat. He was careful to say that he was loyal to his mistress, and that she would find out. He pulled out a poisoned arrow from his sleeve in one motion. He wanted to kill Lin Ji after he came down. Suddenly, the gargoyle given to Frank came to life. She unfurled her clawed paws, stuck out her long tongue, and lunged off the book table at Ryan. Ryan couldn't believe his eyes. He was just stunned on the spot, like a stone. The gargoyle grabbed the mouse with its hand and squeezed him tightly, so hard and tight that he couldn't breathe or resist. Ji Jixue watched it with delight and horror. She didn't even try to interfere. The gargoyle brought Ryan to its mouth. Her eyes burned bright ruby red. Her teeth snapped open. It's over. The mouse is no longer in this world. Ji Jixue watched as the gargoyle devoured her subordinate, and he couldn't even let out a single scream. With horror, she realized that it must be her turn after Mouse. The gargoyle extended its tongue toward her, which was already covered in Ryan's blood. But then it sensed there was no threat to the bookstore owner's life, and returned to its original state as a souvenir. Standing on the book table, Lin Ji, walking down the stairs, apologized to her. She stood with her sword and was a little dazed with fear. He started asking, "Where's Ryan? Where's her subordinate? Where'd he go?" She turned her gaze to him, looking kindly, but with drops of sticky sweat on her face from fear, and said he had urgent business to attend to, so he left. Lightning struck the top of the house. A thunderstorm lit up the night sky. For a moment the night was as bright as day. Ji Jixue is sitting in the middle of the bookstore in a chair. Lin Ji leisurely walks down the stairs to her. She thinks to herself how the gargoyle quickly grabbed Ryan. We need to warn Mr. Lin about this. Not like Ryan at that moment. Even Miss G didn't have time to do anything and react properly. And if that gargoyle had attacked Ji Jixue, she would have already been there number 2. Amazing. And she destroyed him instantly. She killed him as if nothing had happened. This was the first time Ji Jixue had ever encountered such a thing. Her predatory ruby eyes are scary, especially after what she's done. Ji Jixue became cold with fear. Her blood ran cold. That's what it feels like when death approaches. Even though she was a warrior, it was too frightening for her. Miss Ji continued to wind herself up. It was like Mr. Lin saw Ryan's disrespect. He found an excuse to leave and killed Mouse for his ignorance. Truly frighteningly elegant. Ruthless, such a disregard for life. It's exactly in keeping with the dark magician's character. Ji Jixue was floundering in her thoughts as to how to save the situation and why she had brought this vile mouse with her. Not only had she asked for help, but she had also upset Mr. Lin. But what scared her the most was that he might think that it was on her orders that Ryan wanted to kill the bookstore owner. Lin Ji approaches her and asks if she's okay, if she's feeling well, and she tries so hard to hide the horror she saw on her face while looking at him. The young guy reassured his guest and told her that there was no need to worry here, she could relax in peace. Lin Ji affectionately told her that there was no need to be afraid, and he wasn't going to eat her, although he still looked sinister in her eyes. After saying that, she felt sick to her stomach. She just opened her mouth in fear and was ready to cry. Ji Jixue tried her best to squeeze out only one word: "I'm sorry." Her eyes became just square and she didn't even know where to start. She was so afraid of Lin Ji's anger. She started waving her arms frantically from side to side and saying some ridiculous things. About the rude servant, about how she shouldn't have brought him here, that it wasn't her fault at all. Lin Ji began to ask himself with a satisfied look, what was it that made her so nervous that she started to get so nervous a lot? It was unusual. He was kidding. He's not a cannibal. He's never eaten anyone in his life. What could have scared her so much? She's sitting there, poor thing. She's shivering. Can one be so gullible as a harmless person like Mr. Lin, capable of such terrible things? The girl seemed really out of this world to him. Too bad that bastard deceived her so cruelly. No, that won't work. We should try and talk her down. She trusted the bookstore owner invisible last time and came to him for help this time. This time we need to assert our control. Maybe the potential customer will get better. Lin Ji told her that he apologized. He won't joke like that again. If Ji Jixue has any ideas, let them share them with him. He'll do his best to help. She was so relieved, she sighed, said she was sorry for the inconvenience, and asked for a book recommendation. She thought it's a good thing Mr. Lin forgave her for her mistake. She'll be more careful in the future. Lin Ji lightly tapped his palm on the book table and said that he needed to think for a while. Taking a book from the shelf, he ponders going to the restroom for 5 minutes. But in that time, something happened to Miss Ji. Maybe it's because her servant had an urgent matter to attend to. Speaking of Ryan, taking the spine of the book carefully, he pulls it from the shelf. Definitely, Lin Ji said, that subordinate didn't have the right views. Ji Jixue cringed slightly at these words. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye and voiced, "It's best not to talk about absolute fidelity. There's no such thing in nature." Ji Jixue just went cold. How could it be possible that he's... Well, that only meant one thing, from Lin-san's words, that there was something wrong with the rune of loyalty. A high-class white mage has placed this rune of loyalty, and there is only one person who knows the way to remove it. The runes on Ryan's soul were placed by the white magician Haywood. If the rune has stopped working, it means that the white magician Haywood secretly passed it on to another. Ji Jixue almost cries. She sits there upset. She doesn't know who and what to trust anymore. Lin Ji said clearly that one can only rely on oneself at all times. You can only trust yourself. A stranger's soul is a dark forest of uncharted territory. The human heart will never fully open to anyone. So if you want to be invincible, be like steel, and no one can defeat you. Lin Ji pulls aside a book labeled How Steel Was Tempered for Her. But she says the word steel and reaches for that book. The young fellow says she should definitely familiarize herself with this great book. He handed her the book forward, and regardless of what she would learn from it, it would help her. You have to strike while the iron is hot. The most valuable thing for a man is his life. He has only one. It must be cherished. Ji Jixue clutched the book to herself. One must memorize the voice of the person as it should be, looking back on your past. You don't need to regret a ridiculous, vain life and wasted your time. You don't have to blame yourself for despising people and leading a vulgar life yourself. You have to live your life in such a way that you don't feel painful for the years you have lived aimlessly. Each of us has our own mission and destiny. Ji Jixue stood in the rain with an umbrella near the windows of the bookstore. The inscription on the book is Steel Will. The book is quite large, gray in color with black patterns. Ji Jixue opened the book in the middle. She began to read it fluently. Suddenly the book began to glow with bright blue lights. The girl was frightened because of this. And suddenly she began to feel every movement of a raindrop, anticipating where it would fall, where it might be, and where it would be. Ji Jixue stood in the middle of the street and saw all those little glowing droplets. She even took out her umbrella to get a better look at them. Her senses sharpened. It was as if she could feel the water from heaven with her whole body. Then she had a vision of a giant red eye looking down at her from the sky. She felt the energy and the pulsation. She felt the power that was everywhere and in everything. An indestructible will like steel, a force that works on the soul. And now that power belongs to her. Every last drop. She looks at Mr. Lin. He's standing next to the gargoyle. The gargoyle stands on a table in the bookstore and sort of guards it. Looking at her in detail, looks at her eyes, her ears, fangs, and encased within it the consumed souls of those who dared to harm their master. She saw Ryan's soul. Haywood's mark was indeed gone. What's going on? Where is this betrayal coming from? Who authorized it? Who knows about it? From the sky, a bright red eye sends out energy to Ji Jixue. She drops the umbrella and stands motionless. And that dark-colored energy rushes into the bookstore. She's got Ryan's soul by the throat. I guess he'll never rest after he dies. Too big a sinner he was. A dark energy is invading the gargoyle. Ji Jixue feels it. She's getting very painful. A sudden attack. It's like something burst in her head. Her legs gave out in pain, and her nose was bleeding bright red blood. Now I get it. That's it. It all makes sense. Mentally, she was transported to the other dimension of the gargoyle so that she could communicate with her late servant Ryan. He didn't say a word, but she got everything she needed out of him. Very satisfied and pleasantly surprised. As expected of Mr. Lin, no less. He was easily able to change my soul by filling it with an enormous amount of ether. Now I have the power to overcome my opponents. With both hands, she grasped her stomach, and it was like butterflies started fluttering in her stomach. It's filling. That feeling of pleasure. It's really wonderful. Ji Jixue is just glowing with happiness. She received such a gift. Lin Jie gave her a second life. A new birth. Her mind was racing with thoughts one after another. Perhaps he wanted to breed a new group of hunters, and the ever-changing lifestyle of hunters would help Ji Jixue a lot. She finally understood what Mr. Lin meant. From now on, she would always be loyal to Lin Ji's instructions and will. Her body would serve his wishes. She would never upset him again. Lin Ji looks up at her from the bookstore. She's standing in the rain without an umbrella. What's going on? Her nose is bleeding. She holds onto her stomach with her hands, and then quickly runs away. Strange thought the young man why she still hadn't left and why her nose was bleeding. No, she's not. She can't be that. She can't be a crazy person with a screw loose. Once the bastard dumped her, she started coming to the bookstore more often. Maybe she fell in love. No, don't jump to any conclusions. She's an incredible woman, but she couldn't be interested in such a simpleton. It's better to think of ways to attract more customers. Heavy footsteps are heard outside the store. The Grand Knight holding Lin Ji's dossier came straight to his bookstore. Raindrops fell on the paper. Even though it was of excellent quality, Lin Ji's file began to crumble from the moisture. Dossier address street number. Abraham Joseph said in a half voice, finally getting to that obscure bookstore. It's raining like a bucket, and there's light beaming from the storefront window. He has a big scar on his face and he stares at the store sign with an evil grin. He's talking to himself. And why this crazy old man dragged himself to this worthless store. There's gotta be some kind of lead to find this psycho. We need to see this for ourselves. I don't trust squirrels. The good shoes fit his feet well. Even though there was rainwater and deep puddles everywhere, his feet remained dry. He stood still. What are you waiting for? It is his duty. He is a knight. Justice must be done above all else. He began to move confidently toward the front door of the store. A hand in a clean white glove gently touched the binding of the book. For some reason, this book was the one I'd chosen. Lin Ji sat in front of the bookshelf on a well-kept chair with his leg tucked in. He leisurely brought the book towards him. The clean binding of the book shows the inscription, The Little Prince. The binding was a dark blue color. It is velvet-like. Lin Ji carefully holds it in his hands. He relished going over the thoughts in his head. This is a tale with a good philosophy, thought he. It speaks of good principles. It's a great choice for tonight's evening reading. There was the sound of a bell above the front doors of the store. The bell was soft, but it was clearly audible. Lin Ji turned around, holding the book in his hands, and looked at the open doors. His small store was so dry, warm and cozy, while outside it was pouring like a bucket. And he thought to himself that a new guest must have arrived. Today must be a good day. New visitors are always good for business. He was reminded of Ji Jixue who had bought the book from him. Indeed, she must be like a cart bringing great luck. Abraham Joseph came into the bookstore with heavy footsteps, looking rather menacing. He was dressed in dark clothes, and he had an unkind expression on his face. Lin Ji said hello to the visitor and offered his help. He also said that he could either buy a book or borrow one to read. But he mentally questioned himself that the visitor was new, but he gave off an unfriendly vibe. Abraham Joseph remained silent, and looked at Lin Ji with a concentrated gaze. His left eye was glowing a bright violet color. He was scanning the store for energy. He thought to himself that the book revision was the most common. He looked around at the large bookshelves. Nothing is really absent. Absent entirely of all etheric vibrations. Then he looked at Lin Ji. Wasted time. What this young fellow might not know about the old worm. There was no need to question him. Suddenly, the stranger's attention was drawn to the gargoyle. She's really strange. The old man would never give such a gift for nothing. Definitely, there must be a trick to it. The stranger finally asked the guy a question. The bookstore really belongs to him. Therefore, he is the owner. Lin Ji, thinking to himself that his new visitor was not at all talkative or friendly. He thought of a way to address him while keeping his distance. So he called the visitor uncle. Abraham Joseph grimaced at what he heard. Just an uncle. His eyes widened and his face became surprised and amused. The thoughts raced through his mind one after another. If only a young knight had dared to address him like that, he would have given him a beating. Lucky for the bookstore owner that he was only a simple man. He brought his 2 hands down on the bookstand with a loud thud, and his anger was just raging inside him like wildfire. It was just tearing him apart. But he remained calm and silent. Barely containing his anger, Abraham Joseph questioned the bookstore owner about the gargoyle. After all, it belonged to him. Calmly answering him, Lin Ji says that indeed the gargoyle is his property, and it is not for sale. The anger inside Abraham Joseph grew more and more. What an impudent man, not even realizing he was facing a great knight, who certainly won't buy anything. A little calmer, Abraham Joseph took a breath and closed his eyes. He needed to gather his thoughts. Anger was a bad counselor in this case. The gargoyle might be very strong, you can't just break it. That was the thought that occurred to the Grand Knight. Then the stranger asked the owner and mentioned Frank Wilde. He's looking for him. Lin Ji confirmed that he knew this customer, and to himself he noted that some suspicious type. He knows Frank, but could he be his enemy? That's the question. And then Abraham Joseph thought about the fact that Frank couldn't reveal his name and say who he really was. And besides, a gargoyle, it's a very unusual thing to give to a mere mortal. No, it doesn't fit. Taking a pensive pose, the Grand Knight began to ponder to himself. He was wrong about the bookstore. It was as ordinary as its owner. Although, maybe this store is just a place of communication. Lin Ji looked at the visitor. This uncle certainly had a stern look, but based on his own experience, the young man couldn't say that the visitor was bad. A thought ran through his head. A great knight, despite his very strong energy. He didn't break anything in the shop. That meant he was a cautious man. Well, what reason could there be for discord or conflict between him and Frank? We don't know. And as old Holmes has already said, that the method of elimination is very effective, and the last variant is true. And this variant is self-evident. Lin Ji asked Abraham Joseph if he was Frank's friend. The Grand Knight's mind went into overdrive, and he got a big laugh out of that realization. Which, of course, is foolishness. Well, he didn't show it. But in a way, he and he are old acquaintances, and Abraham Joseph has known Frank for years. He opened his mouth and tried to get fresh air into his lungs to continue his speech without stammering. He continued to explain to Lin Ji that they could be called true friends, but unfortunately about a little over 2 years ago, they had a fight and parted ways in an ugly way. Abraham Joseph was already imagining how he would tear Frank to pieces, punching and stomping him. His only desire at the moment was to rip his head off. Lin Ji thought that how nice it was for 2 old buddies to keep their relationship so warm. Then he said to Joseph, "It is not surprising that you knew at once that it belonged to Mr. Wilde," pointing to the gargoyle. "Friendship like that is very rare. It's touching to the core." The Grand Knight tells Lin Ji that it would be very nice if Frank knew that his friend has been searching hard all these years. Maybe the owner of Lin Ji knows where Frank is now. Then an old friend could check on him himself. The young man, pouring tea, says that he himself would like to know Mr. Wilde's address, for he took the book a few days ago. But he is bound to come back after a while. A cup of fragrant tea stood on the book rack. Lin Ji suggested that Abraham Joseph sit down out of the way and rest. Stay and wait for Frank. Maybe he would show up. He smiled contentedly and asked what some book he might be interested in. The great knight sighed unhappily and asked the bookstore owner if he looked so bad that it was obvious from the outside that he needed a rest. Abraham Joseph looked at Lin Ji carefully and pondered. Ever since he became a great knight, no one had dared to talk to him like this young man. At any rate, he entertains the guests quite well. His hand reached for the back of his chair. It's hard to imagine having and maintaining this business every day. The same questions and greetings. What book to offer? Well, a little relaxation isn't a bad thing either. Abraham Joseph showed with his gesture that he didn't like reading, and he didn't have any money with him now. But it does not suit him to sit down and drink tea. Yes, old age is no joy. Smiling contentedly, Linji thought to himself that some types of people are arrogant and cold, but become contentedly pleasantly soft in certain situations. Holding his white-gloved hand over his cup of tea, Linji said that there was no charge for reading, unless it was only in the library. One must first warm up properly with the fragrant tea. Abraham Joseph said he didn't need anything. He wasn't going to read anything. He was just going to sit and rest for a while. His headache had been bothering him, and he had been getting it over and over again. With the elbow of his right hand, he lightly touches a book that lies next to him on the table. He turned his attention sharply to her. Son of the Abyss. Out of the corner of his eye, he read the title on the book. Linji said that he had just read a very interesting story. He suggested it to his guest. He recommended it because it helped him relax quite well. While sipping tea, Abraham Joseph jeeringly told him that fairy tales were for children, and that the boy was no longer a child himself. He did not understand why he was wasting his time and reading such books. Linji calmly replied that he was sorry, but he thought to himself that he was more familiar with this tone. But whether he was young or not was still a question. Well, the store owner is still praising this book. He really liked it. Only one copy. Abraham Joseph points his finger at a book and clarifies exactly what book he means. Maybe the guy's wrong. Feeling a little awkward, the young bookstore owner confirmed that it was a classic and an excellent choice, if we're talking about fairy tales, and waited for some objection from his guest, holding the book, The Little Prince in velvet binding with one hand and white gloves. One can immediately see the bookstore owner's reverent attitude to books. He wanted to significantly extend their lifespan. Thinking to himself, Abraham Joseph of course wondered who read such tales before bedtime. And then there's the name Son of the Abyss. What these tales were for, he could not understand. But it's still worth the attention, as is the time spent reading it. You can get a lot of damn useful and clever things out of this tale. The great knight sitting at the table extends his hand and asks his host to give him this book of tales and let him familiarize himself with it better. As if to deny it, he tries to show Linji that he is not backing down from his principles, just taking a quick glance at her to satisfy the young lad's desire. Satisfied with himself, the young man smiles and thinks to himself that he didn't make a mistake with this uncle. The harsher on the outside, the softer and gentler on the inside. A young lad hands the Grand Knight a book with the attitude that he should succumb to the enchantment of the stories he reads. Out of the blue, Abraham Joseph is hit with an energy surge. Tingling and dizzy. He doesn't know what's happening to him. His head just splits apart. The ground just goes out from under his feet. His whole body starts to shake. Suddenly, Candela's sword appears out of nowhere. The hallucinations begin again. Abraham Joseph catches himself thinking that he is falling into a dream, but he refuses to believe it. At the last moment, he looks at the bookstore owner. His body refuses to listen to him. He loses consciousness. The eyes close of their own accord, and darkness covers the eyes. Linji looks at him with big round eyes. What's wrong? Is his guest all right? Looking at the unconscious body on the floor. The shopkeeper is quickly going over the options in his head and what could have happened: a stroke. A brain hemorrhage, could have been a heart attack. Anything. People don't just fall unconscious. Reaches his hands out to him quickly and frantically tries to check for signs of life from the Grand Knight. He's trying to feel for a pulse. We need to administer first aid, then call an ambulance as soon as possible. He touches 2 fingers to his carotid artery, gently probing. He touches his carotid artery with 2 fingers. He is quite surprised by what he sees. The bookstore owner is a little taken aback. He looks at Abraham Joseph lying on the floor. He hears his steady, calm breathing and feels with his fingers the strong beating of his heart. But these are signs of deep sleep. He smiled and calmed down. This uncle is still very fit and healthy. Linji will be healthier than him. And then the young lad begins to wonder why he suddenly lost consciousness. It can't be because of the book he had placed in his hands. To look at a book today with the title The Little Prince and immediately faint, the reason is ridiculous. At least it doesn't seem to be true. Sighing heavily, Linji makes the decision to move his guest to the bed. He can't stay on the floor. When he wakes up, we'll have to question him. Mr. Lin is breathing heavily. He's having a hard time. He's not in the best physical shape. He tries to pick Joseph up and drag him to the bed, but he's too heavy. You can see he's straining as hard as he can. He feels like his backbone is going to break from the strain. In fact, he's not even able to move it even a meter off the ground. The great knight was very heavy himself, not counting the weight of his iron arm. Crawling beside Joseph on his knees, Linji thought sure he was heavy, but not that heavy. What he's made of, it's like he's got muscles of steel. That's a bit much for a simple librarian, but it's normal for a grand knight. After catching his breath a little, he sat down next to Joseph, thinking that if he'd been as skinny as Frank, there wouldn't have been a problem. As it was, he'd have to wait for other customers to help drag him to the couch. The young guy says he's sorry for you, but he has to do it anyway, and apologizes to him in advance. He approached the Grand Knight from the side of his head, and gripped his clothes tightly with both hands, and started dragging Abraham Joseph across the floor like a rag. It is clear that his clothes will be in disrepair after such a thing. Clearly even the cat was surprised to see this picture. The owner is dragging some guy, dead or alive, basically unconscious on the floor. Lin Ji finally dragged him to the wooden couch. He barely pushed him onto it. His right hand made a sort of metallic sound, like something clanking. Lin Ji took a closer look. It caught his attention. It turns out Abraham Joseph has a mechanical prosthetic made of metal in place of his right arm. Looking closely at the Grand Knight's arm, he concludes that the man is as disabled as his friend Frank. The work on the prosthesis is flawlessly done. Ordinary people can't use it. Great precision in this work. In addition, the Great Knight had a very powerful physique and incredible energy. Just then, Lin Ji suddenly realized one thing. He thought that maybe this uncle was actually some high-ranking officer, but retired. Yes, it's very similar in manner of speech and firmness of character. He's met retired officers before in his life. He's had experience. He seems to be so violent and tough because of his injuries after the war. And he probably lost his right hand on the battlefield. That's where the mechanical prosthetic came from. It all made sense to him now. Old people like that are usually the most stubborn. Moisture can cause a short circuit in a mechanical prosthesis. It's not just metal, it's electrical. That could be one of the reasons he passed out. And it's a plausible reason. The young lad standing beside the sleeping Abraham Joseph thought and remained silent. None of his customers in his bookstore had ever fainted before. He couldn't remember such a thing. But on the other hand, Lin Ji thought something was weighing him down. He felt something strange because of this whole situation going on. I feel like he's like a butcher who killed a man on a dark, rainy night, and then dragged his corpse into a dark store to cover up the crime. Then, frowning hard, he tried to brush those thoughts away. Despite the fact that bad thoughts creep into his head and the situation is misleading, it's all nonsense. A good, honest person is not afraid of slander. The doors to the store opened quietly, and the frightened cat watched the bookstore owner drag the unconscious body somewhere in the darkness. Abraham Joseph lay unconscious on the couch with a book in one hand. He seemed to really like this book, because even when he lost consciousness, he held onto it with a steady grip. Lin Ji looked at this with a bit of mortification and sighed. A worthy warrior. Strong men can have good dreams too. They're like a fairy tale. It's best not to disturb him. Listened to some kind of thumping outside the store door, in a dark alley. Lin Ji looked carefully and asked who was there. The front door of the store opened quietly by itself, and he saw some kind of footprint. It looked a lot like a cat's. A young guy went out on the porch in the rain to see who it could be. Maybe it was some kind of abandoned animal, and he saw a cat running away, meowing. He couldn't make out its color, but it looked like it was black. He smiled a little surprised and said it was just a cat. He waved and wished him well, and warned him that it might not be safe to go home quickly outside. The cat ran like a scalded man in the rain, paying no attention to anything. All he did was swear like a human. Finally stopping, he was out of breath. He needed to catch his breath. Then, with all his might, he began to shake himself off into the water. Looking back with horror and fear, he checks to see if Lin Ji has caught up with him. Then he screamed in a human voice and canceled the transformation. And then the cat's eyes lit up with bright yellow lights, and he started to turn into a human. His name was Morrison Gregg. He's a researcher in the intelligence department of the Secret Tower. He cried and couldn't believe it. How this was possible. A great knight, Abraham Joseph, had been killed in front of his eyes. He respected Grand Knight Joseph very much. He exerted all his strength to enter the intelligence department of the Secret Tower. He was finding a connection that he clearly recognized between the Great Knight Joseph and the Dark Wizard Destroyer Frank Wilde. Of course, out of concern for his idol, he followed him cautiously on his heels, all the way to the bookstore. He didn't think it was possible. Absolutely no magical reaction. It seems like a simple bookstore. You could get an autograph. For 10 minutes he sits in the rain and gets soaked. Morrison Gregg begins to complain about the slowness of his idol. And you're here peeking into the bookstore to see what's going on. His cat face pokes through the doorway. He's very curious. And then he sees the falling body of Abraham Joseph. His idol just falls without strength or feeling to the ground. Gregg starts yelling to himself what's going on. Already he's just been laughing and talking. And who is this young man? Morrison Gregg asked himself. Some kind of magic must have been used. He tried to get as much of a look as he could while looking through the doorway, but he didn't dare to go all the way into the store. From helplessness, he looked on with sad eyes. They were full of fear and regret. And worst of all, he could not help his idol. He looks at Lin Ji. He stands by the window looking at the rainy sky and says the words associated with dreaming for heroes, and calms the unconscious Abraham Joseph, lying on the floor. Morrison Gregg thinks he wishes the eternal night never woke up. And he's probably not just unconscious, he's no longer with us. And then with his cat paw, he accidentally grazes some jar on the porch of the bookstore. He realized that Linji had noticed it, and he needed to get out of here right away. The sooner the better. He just ran like black furry lightning. As far away from the store as possible, as fast as possible. He wouldn't be able to handle Linji. Everything was too incomprehensible. He only heard Linji's last words spoken after him as he ran like a scalded man. Morris and Greg sat in the rain on the wet paving stones and cried. That's the feeling of the end. The bookstore owner could have easily killed him, but he let him go. Probably so he could report him to his superiors. His face was completely swollen with tears and grief. He barely stopped. He worked for a year as an investigator from the Secret Tower's intelligence department. He quickly transformed back into a cat, and he urgently needs to return to the department and report back. Determined to help his idol, he is serious about running faster to his duty station. Abraham Joseph came to his senses. He opened his eyes and sighed. He feels like he's underwater, and he's asking himself where it is. He catches himself thinking that he may be underwater, but it's definitely a hallucination from Kandal's cursed sword. But why doesn't it hurt? That's odd. Abraham Joseph suddenly sees an unusual pink glow in front of his face. And then he hears a voice, which tells him that people who notice the abyss then become the object of attention of the same abyss. Then there is a picture of him in the water with a book in front of him that is twice his size. These are lines from the same book that describes the fairy tale. He's getting a terrible headache. It's like these lines of books are being forced into his head. My head is just cracking at the seams from the strain. And then Candela's magic sword appears, in a bright purple glow. It's good to finally see you again. The feeling is more gradually coming together. The book has revealed such an impression that the sword came straight out of it. Abraham Joseph begins to realize that it was the emotion of the sword, and reaches for it. Suddenly he sees bright strands in his blonde hair. A warrior standing with his back to him in armor with long and blonde hair, holding the sword of Candle with one hand. That's the kind of story that needs... The sword was confidently in his firm and strong hand. The fairy tale really needs to be shown to children. Abraham Joseph opened his eyes. He realized he was on the couch, but he didn't know how he got there, and he started to get up slowly. He looks at the book labeled Son of the Abyss, and remains silent. Linji looks at the Grand Knight, and realizes that he has come to his senses. Uncle's awake is a good thing, the young bookstore owner thought. He was very happy. It was as if a mountain had fallen from his shoulders. The Grand Knight smiled crookedly. It wasn't pretty, but it was from the bottom of his heart. Looking at the young man, he thanked him for his help. Abraham Joseph got up and came to his senses, and thanked the young bookstore owner, because he realized he could have been lying on the floor. But he found himself on the couch. Linji said without a word of thanks. It was something that had to be done. Now he hoped that the great knight was feeling much better. Joseph stood up holding a book in his left hand, and everything seemed to be fine. He felt a surge of strength. He told Linji that he was feeling great. Surprisingly, he felt very good. It was evident from his face. The young lad admires the great knight. His body power is really enviable. Beastly. No one would even think that he is a retired military man. It seems his gaze is becoming more precise. Linji is beginning to think that because of his uncle's size and physique, only one blow from him would be enough to be a dead man. If only Frank's weak body receives such a blow, he will crumble on the spot. Good thing Frank and Joseph are friends, as he realized and believed. Joseph apologized again to the young bookstore owner. He realized he was just sitting there, but he had gotten so much help. He felt very bad about that. Linji smiled and said that there was no need to be grateful, and there was no need to be shy. He said the same thing to Frank, that they were both customers, and it was his duty to help them. Abraham Joseph seems to have understood the bookstore owner's style of thinking. Must help the customer. The owner helps the customer, no matter what kind of person the customer is. Good or bad. You can go into his store and you become a customer, the object of his help. That's a position the Great Knight has only seen in one species. Elves. They're a long-lived, graceful race. If the owner of this bookstore is one of them, then everything makes sense. Only a very long life has caused him to pursue one pleasure. He doesn't distinguish between right and wrong. He doesn't want to waste time. He doesn't need it anymore. This way of speaking is most likely due to a very long life. Well, as for the store, it's a true embodiment of the elves' craving for knowledge. People don't really like to read these days. Not into literature. Legends have been passed down by word of mouth for thousands of years. Prince of an ancient elven kingdom, an elven king, and the very first madman. There's no other way to call him. He killed himself with his own sword, and he encased his soul in that sword. And now Candle's sword bears a curse. The soul of the first elven king made it magical. It's a sword of great power, but there's a price to pay. From now on, Every wielder of the sword dies mad. Until today, Abraham Joseph felt that this day was just around the corner and was about to come. Well, he couldn't even imagine that the book Lin Jie had given him would be able to neutralize the madness of the Candela sword. A true miracle. How could a bookstore owner carrying such a book not be an elf? No other thought crosses the Grand Knight's mind. And an elf with such a book must be a very old monster who has lived for centuries. And it seems that he used all his magic power to prolong his life. Lin Jie looks at him curiously. It all fits perfectly within the framework of the Great Knight theory. Abraham Joseph asked a young boy if he could borrow this book to read. Lin Jie replied approvingly that yes, of course you can. Otherwise, he wouldn't have recommended her. This was a good decision. The young guy was very pleased with himself. This was a good time to heal his companion with good words. Lin Jie said that he knew from the first time he spoke what kind of book would be suitable for Joseph. He went on and told the Grand Knight that there are a lot of people like him with the same mental problems. Lack of their own strength drags and regret. Makes you doubt yourself. That's what makes it crazy. Yes, men who've been to the battlefield, burned by the flames of war, often feel bad about the mistakes they've made. The trauma of war stays with them for life. Lin Jie said that they never lost by their own torment. They were defeated by their own cowardly goodness, kindness. Unlikely. Abraham Joseph did not know the previous owners of Candela's sword, but he understood from their regrets that they lacked their own strength. A great knight asked a bookstore owner if being kind was a bad thing, to which the young lad replied that kindness is good always if it is not cowardly. It has to do with having inflated expectations of other people. You don't have to judge everyone by yourself. Not necessarily everyone around you is like you and has the same value system. Lin Jie continued. He says that in their desire to help others, they appear to themselves to be significant. But, in reality, their defenses are none. It's very fragile. It may help others, but certainly not the one who helps them. Abraham Joseph. Once the soul dies, anything can take its place. There can be no vacuum. You can be an ordinary person sometimes, and you don't have to make an all-powerful hero out of yourself. Sometimes successfully escaping rather than destroying yourself is also brave. That's how cleverly he twisted it. Customized wisdom. The Great Knight was a little stunned by such words. It wasn't because of the curse of Kandal's sword. It was about the soul's desire for perfectionism, and why it was only now being realized. Abraham Joseph slammed his fist on the table and asked, "And how long would he last after this appeasement?" Lin Jie thought that it wouldn't be enough for his honored guest to need a very good therapist as well. The young lad answered him that of course not. It wouldn't last long. But if the Great Knight allows him to help him, the bookstore owner will be able to prolong the effect. He hopes that his guest and customer will not be able to return to his psychological problem for a long time. Abraham Joseph was simply at a loss for words and interrogated Lin Jie what he meant, because it seemed to the Great Knight that he could take away the sword curse. He had already heard the gossips say that he was the longest-lived of the knights who wielded the magic sword. Well, that's because he decided to retire before the sword defiled him. He stood as if dead. Didn't question the fact that the invincible sacred flame no longer frightened anyone now as it once had. Perhaps you wanted to go down before Kandal's sword did. He stared at the book table and remained silent. It was written all over his face. He squeezed the mechanical prosthetic. Maybe he was really lucky now that he let it go and unleashed it right away. Maybe he's finally found the true successor to that sword. Abraham Joseph asked Lin Jie if he was sure about this, because it might entail certain difficulties. And it would be very difficult to deal with them. The young guy smiles and thinks to himself that it really is Frank's friend. They're both so kind. To himself, he's happy. He's blooming like a sunshine. But he's still in control because he's a professional life coach. No need to lose face. He calmly tells Joseph he has a difficulty he can't deal with right now. He just doesn't have the strength. If he needed to, the young shopkeeper could easily give him the book. Frank didn't understand what he meant. Probably didn't even realize it right away. How to respond to that sentence. Whether it's appropriate or not. What to do next. Heroes should be with rest too. You can't take on too much. It's a very heavy load. You have to take some time off. Suddenly, a glow appeared in front of the Grand Knight's eyes. The young bookstore owner appeared before him in a bright yellow glow, as if he were a saint. Joseph marveled at his unselfishness and nobility. He must be immortal. Lin Jie was shining like the sun. Rays of light were coming from him in different directions. There was a lot of light, and it was unimaginably bright. Abraham Joseph smirked and realized there was some kind of trick. It couldn't be that simple. Then he told Lin Jie that it was too early to talk about rest. First the work must be done, then world peace, and only then can one go to rest. As he left, the Great Knight told the bookstore owner that he needed time to think. He asked to borrow the book for a couple of days and would return it. Lin Jie agreed. Only need to register, write out the basic information, and it would be possible to borrow the book. Rather, a keen sense of justice is the burden of every military man. It leaves an indelible mark on them. Well, new customers are always good for business. The young man took out a record card and a pen. You have to pay a cash deposit and then take the book. But you have to write the date and your name. If you don't want to take the book again, the store will refund half of the deposit. Abraham Joseph began filling out a bookstore card. It's a bookstore after all, not a free used book fair. The Grand Knight is concentrating on writing in all the information he needs. Just a little more, and it will be ready. Linji takes the card and gives the book to Joseph. He is expecting him a week later. Abraham Joseph bowed handsomely to the young bookstore owner and said goodbye, walking towards the exit, toward the door of the bookstore. He was very glad that already his attacks had left him. He sighed heavily, but now he had found peace of mind. Now the terrible hallucination did not torment him. Now there's only one thing to do to stand up for justice. Frank got help from a bookstore owner. That's why he survived. But that won't stop Abraham Joseph from killing the dark magician Frank Wilde himself. This is the meaning of life. Duty and obligation. And it must never be abandoned. It's a matter that cannot be tolerated. In a dark, rainy alley, a small door was visible. A green smoke and a glow flickered ominously from the door. Something evil seemed to be going on behind that door. The dark mage of destruction was performing his ritual. Everything was in full swing. The green energy was boiling and raging. He was working with the knowledge he had gotten from Linji's book. His snake eyes were filled with green energy, truly unfathomable. He wrote a new witchcraft spell, new formula, and marveled at the breadth of knowledge that emphasized from the precious book. Knowledge so deep and vast that it simply seems unfathomable. Frank got a headache and started to crack up. He was really excited with happiness. The Dark Sorcerer Destroyer understood the value of this knowledge. The lines of the spell are transferred to a special parchment. It glows with a poisonous emerald glow. The ritual is truly horrific. Frank felt it was a great achievement. Now is the moment of truth, and the time is now. He stands at full height in the middle of his lab and stares at his black mask. It's been almost 2 years since he lost his human form in battle with the Great Knight, and this mask he must wear to hide his ugliness. Thanks to the Devil's Tongue, Frank will be able to familiarize himself with the rituals of the Corpse Eaters, and so he can also learn the secrets of the civilization that carried them out. Knowledge is true power and strength, and for this knowledge the Dark Magician Destroyer Frank Wilde will thank the young bookstore owner Lin Ji properly. He's sure he'll like the gift. Pen, notebooks, sheets of paper fell from his hands. Clodagh was just furious. She grabbed the cat and started shaking it in different directions, and she couldn't believe that Joseph had dropped dead in the bookstore. Morris and Greg, in cat form, no longer knew just where to go. He was half unconscious from Clodagh's shaking and rage. Claude quickly realized she needed to think things through. Even though it was the Grand Knight who was in trouble, the slightest mistake would lead to unimaginable negative consequences. The cell phone on the table rang. She quickly grabbed the phone and started yelling into it, demanding a quick situation report. After all, a man had been sent there, and it was urgent to get information. And then she listens quietly to the report of the man who was sent to the bookstore as an observer. She imagined herself as a little girl for a moment. She didn't immediately realize that the Grand Knight was fine, and with a book in his hands quietly walked out of the bookstore by himself. The observer stopped his report and hung up the phone. Then the phone rings and she sees that her boss Abraham Joseph is calling her. He's bizarrely signed on her phone. She frantically reports back, though she still can't believe that her teacher is on the other side of the phone, alive and well. The Grand Knight asks Clodagh if she has orders, then instructs her to immediately remove all observers from 23rd Street. The reason this store falls into a special category of facilities, level N subject, and that's when Clone's legs gave out. This level corresponds to top secret. She's frantically remembering all the classifications, and level N turns out to be the most serious. Claude tries to find out from the Grand Knight what finally happened in that bookstore. She can't figure out who the owner of the store is. Listen to her. The Grand Knight remains silent. She asked him questions and he didn't know what to say. At least he didn't interrupt her. Then he asks if there's anyone near Claude. He looks at the 3 cats beside him. She said she did. She's worked with Joseph for a long time and knows him well. And she realizes he's a little angry right now. She's holding a half-dead Morris and Greg in cat form. He's foaming at the mouth. She's so sick of him with her tantrums. And then Morris and Greg gets hit in the head, so much so that his cat's eyes pop out of his orbits. She apologizes to the Grand Knight for not thinking, and he asks her why she hasn't shut her mouth yet, and start working, if she realizes she's screwed up. He threatens to send her to grow potatoes instead of working in the department, and she starts shaking her head and says she doesn't want to go digging potatoes, and she's going to pass on the Grand Knight's orders right now. Clodagh breathed a sigh of relief, because her mentor is speaking calmly. So he's not in any danger, he's safe. Good thing he's old school. Fanning the flames and blowing other people's heads off is unacceptable. As long as she's helping him, everything will be done right. She's ordering the other observers off 23rd Street. It is wit combined with a good heart that is the foundation of the Great Knight's morals. It is her teacher's style. Carrying the 3 cats on his back, Joseph walks away from the bookstore. Claude gives the order. All this is how the situation is perceived at the moment. Basically, the Grand Knight demands a special dossier be created. The elders must understand the current situation. A voice comes out of the phone receiver. Copy that. Let's start creating a new dossier. Kay Loto thanks whoever is on the other side of the bell. She then notifies the Grand Knight that the dossier has been approved and needs to be filled out personally by his hand. Abraham Joseph swings open the doors of his office with force, and he speaks perfectly. Claude drops the receiver in surprise. She didn't expect him to get here so quickly. He praised his subordinate. He told her to use a spell of oblivion to erase the memory of whoever was around her. Morrison Gregg in the body of a cat is lying on his back with dazed eyes, and Claude is holding him by the throat. She realizes she's forgotten about the oblivion spell. She begins to explain to Joseph that one of their scouts, Morrison Gregg, is from a family of mages with good powers of transformation, and he's a fan of the Grand Knight, and begins to praise his activism and loyalty. Clodagh said that Morrison Gregg is without a doubt the ultimate Grand Knight fan. Joseph is typing on a computer keyboard. Despite his metal prosthesis, he uses it with great dexterity. He asks his assistant if it's Morrison Gregg. She confirms it. Instead of spending the magician family's money on nonsense, you can bring it to your idol. It's the right thing to do. With a sly look, the Great Knight said, "Let him pay the tuition, and the cost of intimacy will go to his liking." Claude was tearing up inside with anger. How could such a greedy man be a great knight who cheats everyone, even a child? But in words, she agreed with him. She's organizing the whole thing. Joseph rejoiced. After all, even the erased memory was preserved. He filled out a top-secret level dossier. The judge filling out the investigation will continue to go on and on. Press the enter key on the keyboard. Abraham Joseph ordered a top-secret dossier for a reason. It will help scare away anyone who wants to enter this bookstore, and also to keep them away from Linji. And whoever doesn't listen, the Grand Knight wishes them luck in the game of death. Night, light in the window of the house. Joseph is on the phone. He repeats that he is fine. No need to believe the rumors of his death. He seems to have downloaded all the archived data. Standing there in his beautiful pink bunny pajamas, getting ready for bed. Calls his interlocutor an asshole and tells him not to worry and to open his eyes finally. He put the phone receiver back down with a bang, because this conversation was getting on his nerves. Big trouble would be waiting for Claude tomorrow. He opened the book that Linji had given him. He is very happy with his peaceful state. He has noticed it. The changes in his psyche are not due to the effects of the book. This is wonderful. I heard the bell ring. He's sitting on a chair reading a book. He's distracted by the bell. I guess this knucklehead's brains are all in the right place. Joseph was angry. He had not received the profit he was entitled to and was still waiting for compensation for moral damage. Suddenly he saw Melissa, and he asked her for a glass of milk before bedtime. It was his daughter, and she started getting all cranky and screaming that she knows everything, and she remembers. She said she's not a kid anymore. She's already a captain of the Knights with an abnormal level, and asks him not to remind her of what she already knows. To which Joseph replied to her that she was very dear to him, and he asked to drink milk to make her healthier. And if she's not healthy and tall, she'll never get married. And who'd want her like that little girl? And it made her very angry. She didn't like it when her father talked like that, as if he had muscles in his head instead of brains. Suddenly she saw an unfamiliar book on the table. It caught her attention. She was angry with her father, but deep down she loved him. But the presence of the book surprised her, for her father had never read. And it seemed that a dark aura surrounded the book, and she reached her hand toward it, seating herself at the round table. She began to read. She read quickly and flipped through the pages, remaining silent and absorbing the meaning of each line read. It immediately becomes clear that the girl can read well. The pace of her reading accelerated considerably. She literally swallowed page after page. Indeed, such a reading speed could be envied by anyone. Her bright sapphire eyes never took their eyes off the book for a second. Reading took her over. She found something very, very important in the book. At last, she reached the most interesting part. It so captured her imagination and impressed her mind that her pupils constricted with excitement. And then she heard the shuffle of her father's gait. He says it's not worth bothering him, and the owner of this bookstore can make a Grand Knight faint without resistance. If any of those who are bothering him now in the middle of the night are capable of it, he'll give them access to the secret archive tomorrow. Some fools who don't realize they're playing with death. A sharp slam of his hand into the wall. He's trying to keep the ignorant fools from dying in vain. He got the impression they were looking for trouble themselves. Melissa hears the thud of a thud against the wall and tries to hurriedly finish the last pages of the book. She quickly slams the book shut and steps away from the table. Walks past her father as if nothing had happened, that she hadn't read anything or touched a book. Suddenly he turns to her. She flinches. It's a sight to behold. She thought her father suspected. She started to deny that she had touched the book. But she saw her father holding a glass of milk and repeats to her, "Don't forget the milk." She smiles sweetly and remains silent. And there's just a purple energy and aura of rage flying around her. She quickly removes herself from her father's room and slams the door. He asks himself if his daughter is at a point of transition. It's never easy for a father with his daughters. And then he remembered the family photo on his dresser. You can forgive your daughter's eccentricities. Joseph is a loving father, as long as his daughter grows up strong and healthy. After all, health is the foundation, and the rest will follow. Health isn't everything, but everything is nothing without health. Melissa couldn't realize from outside her father's room who the author of this book was, the main character, the Elf King Candle. Always these tales are so impressively true. It was good for her that her father hadn't noticed anything. But she's really pissed that she's the main one who didn't finish just before the big moment. And that's the thought that's been bugging her. She threw herself into her pillow like a cranky little girl and started calling her father names, and said that her daddy's only virtue was strength and beauty. Then she calmed down and began to think that she shouldn't be too prejudiced against her father. After all, he reads books like this, and that's a big surprise in a surprise. According to my father's phone call, the book was picked up at a bookstore, but this place has a particularly high confidentiality rating. She smiled slyly and said it was just a bookstore, nothing special. The opinion of conservatives who don't need anything, and the future lies with the resourceful. And then she projects an energy key to the N-level access database. It will allow her to get more information from the Secret Service database, a legacy from her own mom. That's how she got the key. In 1 second, holographic data tables appeared in front of her. Mom had once been a great knight too. That's why daughter Melissa got this key. She mentally thanks her mom for this gift. She will try hard to become an excellent knight. She must finish this story. And surely she wants to live up to her mom's expectations. It wasn't long before she found a bookstore with a classified level N. She wasn't surprised. Friendly. Well, there's really nothing entertaining here. Melissa wanted to go and see this bookstore for herself. Turning around, she saw a glass of milk on the table, and she thought of Daddy. Maybe she didn't want to drink it, but she remembered her dad's request, and she realized it would be good for her because her father never wishes any harm. She carefully took the glass from the table. She gripped it tightly so it wouldn't slip out of her hands, and started drinking the milk out of it non-stop. And then I look at my hands wondering if she's grown since then or not. Flash flood warning for the city of Nozin elevated to a red danger category. The entrance to the city is closed. The main cause of the rain is cold air masses from the mountain ranges. The water is already coming in torrents to the door of the bookstore. Lin Ji fights the incoming water as best he can with the mop in his hands. The downpour is getting heavier and heavier. If it continues like this, it will be possible to leave the house in a boat with oars. He works the mop vigorously, collecting water. Exhaling heavily, he realizes it's not even worth mentioning any clients in this inclement weather. And we have enough problems. And right now it's not about books and reading. There was a very big desire of a young man to move out of this bookstore because he became a morning saw a completely flooded floor. He is happy that the books are okay. A little hard work. And the whole floor of the bookstore shines like new, even though the young man was tired. But he was still very happy with the cleanliness. He went to the door, took the sign, and flipped it open. Wiping the glass on the door, he wondered if any of his customers had made it home. It was dangerous to be out in this rain. Meanwhile, Morris and Greg rejoiced like a child. He's in Grand Knight Joseph's office. His personal effects and odor are everywhere. And Claude said he'd had enough. Lin Ji stands by the shop window and wipes the glass, taking the opportunity to remove the excess dirt. Fist bumps on the TV are heard. The owner of the device is very angry that it doesn't work. It doesn't show a clear image. Who would come to his rescue and help him? Who would be able to help him with his problem? He doesn't understand or know yet. He thinks there's nothing wrong with the telecom, nothing wrong with the wiring. That leaves us with the blown fuses. That's the root of the problem. And the switch is outside. I don't want to go out in this crappy weather, in this downpour. It's just creepy. He got the idea maybe his neighbor guy would agree to help. He is always in any case harmless and eager to come to the rescue. So I'm going to give him the opportunity to help. Later, of course, I thank him properly. He calls the neighbor to see if he's home. Silence, not a sound. No one responds. Suddenly, he hears a phrase from a neighbor. "Do you need any help?" He smiles and thinks, well, he's a lucky guy. Good neighbor. And the guy says there's a problem with the TV. Maybe it's blown a fuse now. He's got some business to take care of and he can't leave it, so he asks his neighbor if he can watch it. Linji is listening to his neighbor from the top floor. The switch is right by the back door. You just have to turn it on and that's it. The bookstore owner listened attentively to his neighbor's request. He said he would definitely look at it now. He was ready to go to the back door when a very strange feeling of uneasiness came over him. Something very similar he'd been experiencing for a long time. It's unmistakable. It's a feeling you don't forget. Just then, a large dark head with 2 red eyes appeared in front of Linji. It looked like an evil humanoid. He waved at him affably and called him Blackie. Asked him why he was here. Maybe it was about the new book and its distribution. And then this black humanoid grows a limb. Just the right kind of limb to switch out the blown fuses. And he shows the young bookstore owner this. He's all set. Linji immediately guesses from the limb that Blackie wants to help him. He starts nodding approvingly. Up and down, up and down, up and down. Confirming his agreement. The young guy calls Blackie a well-mannered sweetheart. Last time he said borrowing a book could do him a lot of good. He came to the guy to repay what he received. At this thought, Linji felt genuinely humbled. He didn't refuse Blackie's help. He didn't want to hurt the little one. He gratefully accepted the help, thanked him politely, and left everything in his hands. The door of the store swung open and Blackie crawled like a shadow across the floor and door. He crawled very close to the electrical panel with the plugs, and it was raining like hell. It looked like it could have washed everything away. And Chernish deftly re-engaged the fuse. The neighbor upstairs got the TV working. It was a little miracle for him. Out of the blue, the problem was solved, not even by his hands. The neighbor on the upper floor laughed loudly and happily told Linji that he would definitely help him next time. With kindness, he would remember. The young boy heard Blackie approaching from the doorway of the store. He can see that it goes through the cracks like black slurry. Linji replied to the upstairs neighbor that he wasn't worth thanking, and the neighbor, sitting by the TV set, continues to watch the show. He's very happy that his neighbor helped him out. He's such a nice, helpful guy. He did it all for free, fast. He heard a rustle and felt something wrong. With food in his mouth, he stood frozen in surprise on the sofa. Then he swallowed the food, and his eyes began to widen. Suddenly, he saw a scary picture on the TV. It scared the hell out of him. Tears came to his eyes and he started to scream. The silhouette of the same Chernish who had helped with the electric plugs appeared in his TV. His 2 eyes stared directly at his neighbor, paralyzing him. The lights went out completely on the top floor above the bookstore. The upstairs neighbor who loved to watch TV was no longer alive. Linji sat blissfully on his chair. Smiling to himself, he said that today was a good day despite the bad weather. It's so nice to do good things for people. In time, everything comes back to you in the good-bad, so it's better to focus on the good. It'd be great if you told all your friends about the bookstore. Business would be booming. The doorbell rang, softly and softly as always, but it was clearly audible. Linji sat in a chair with a book and said hello to whoever entered. Although in this weather, it was a surprise to him that any of the visitors would want to come to the store. Could it be that quickly he had just done a good job and already had visitors who could be customers? The rewound arm of the Dark Destroyer mage held on. It was Frank Wilde. He dutifully removed his hat and apologized for the inconvenience. It was strange to expect him today, especially in such a downpour. The young man was pleasantly surprised. It was Frank. He asked him why he had come back so quickly. Maybe he had already read the book in its entirety. Yes, Frank's appearance is quite good. He's dressed tastefully, but not his mask. It's really ugly. Well, the old gentleman knows better. Lin Tai asked Frank that he had intentionally come to see him in such foul weather. There must be some important business to attend to, because it was already extremely unsafe to move around the city streets. Frank bowed, and said that considering the bookstore owner's good relationship with him, the weather didn't matter. This time, he had come to truly express his gratitude to Linji. The young lad replied, pointing at the gargoyle, that he was very pleased with this gift he received last time. If this time the gift was very valuable, he would hesitate to accept it or not. Mr. Lin must be feeling sorry for him and comforting him. That's what Frank thought. The insignificant gargoyle is not even close to the gift he has prepared especially for the young master. But thanks to his generosity, Mr. Lin shows that he cares about the spiritual balance of the Dark Mage. Now, thanks to Linji's gift, the Dark Mage Destroyer was literally one step away from the divine level. Therefore, Frank had prepared something special for the bookstore owner. Frank told Linji that he shouldn't hesitate, since this gift doesn't have much value to a dark magician. But for Linji, this gift could be of great importance. So Frank asked him to accept the offering, so as not to cause the dark magician's soul any discomfort. The young man replied that what he had done for Frank was not worth the effort, but to make a soul uncomfortable was serious. It's been such a long conversation. He doesn't know what to think, what kind of gift it is, so he asked to see it. Frank said he spent 2 years of his life making this gift. That's serious for a dark wizard. He puts his hand on the book table. He hopes his gift will please the young owner of the bookstore. It was a very carefully crafted dream catcher, an Indian amulet that protects the sleeper from evil spirits and diseases. Lin Ji interrogated Frank. Isn't this really the dream catcher? Right, not wrong. He didn't even think that the gift from Frank would be like this. It really brings back memories. A few years ago, before teleporting to Nozin, Lin Ji had participated in a folklore and culture exhibition. It was there that he found out something about dream catchers. It's a symbol of Indian culture. This amulet lured good dreams and warded off evil ones. The dream catcher is a treasured gift at tribal reunions. After talking to an old Indian, he learned more lore about dream catchers. Dream catcher beads are power and wisdom. It helps strengthen people's connection to the spirit world. Lin Ji thought that he would never see a dream catcher here in this world again. This was a pleasant surprise to him. The dark mage destroyer flattered the young bookstore owner, and his level of erudition is impressive. Frank looked closely at the amulet with his snake eyes. That's right. Trapper again is really rare indeed. It's a powerful magical object. But its greatest value is not in itself, but in the dreams it contains. Lin Ji looked at the amulet and thought to himself, this thing is handmade. The quality is good. And the downpour just caused the young lad to stop sleeping well. This is Frank's best wishes. They are truly from the bottom of his heart. The young bookstore owner smiled welcomingly and thanked Frank warmly. To him, this magical item was just right, just what he needed. Frank Wilde looked carefully at Lin Ji with wicked snake-green eyes, and then answered him that he was honored to be truly needed. Inside the dream catcher's nets are incomparable beautiful dreams, but mere mortals cannot use this talisman. You need a very great spiritual power of divine level. Otherwise, the soul will be damaged in no time. But Mr. Lin is not a mere mortal. Frank walked out of the bookstore after politely saying goodbye to Lin Ji, put on his hat, and wished him a good night's sleep. There was a terrible explosion of great force, and one of the towers of the cathedral collapsed. It was as if 1,000 bolts of lightning had struck the structure at one moment. The blast wave knocked Kate off her feet, and she was flying headlong down, along with her weapon. But then, out of nowhere, a metal blade on a chain flew out, as fast as an arrow fired, wrapped his arms around Kate and prevented her from crashing to her death on the ground as she fell. You thanked Max for his help. She already had a firm grip on her weapon. She wasn't in danger of dying. But if it wasn't for Max, she'd be dead. Max didn't expect a magician to be with his opponents. Max yells to Ji Jixue to be careful and watch out for the familiar. A magician casts a spell in an ancient tongue, invoking the magic runes. Grabbing the sorcerer's staff, he directs the deadly energy towards Ji Jixue. Miss Ji, sprinting across the tiles on the cathedral roof, hears a strange sound behind her. She looks back quickly, her pupil constricted from the horror she saw. A giant snake opens its jaws and flies at her to devour her whole. Ji Jixue quickly jumps up to the level of the snake's mouth, tossing his battle cane aside. In an instant, her hand transforms into the huge paw of the wolf hunter, and strikes right through the snake's teeth. The snake's eyes sparkle like jewels. Ji Jixue is covered in blood. Her breathing has become very rapid. She can feel the power of her complete transformation beginning. The snake's skin begins to burst, and blood oozes from the wounds. The sound of tearing flesh can be heard. Miss Jixue turned into a big hunter by her own volition. A huge white wolf with eyes as red as rubies. She tore the snake like a rag in half. Her predatory eyes bloodshot. An uncontrollable animal rage swept over her gaze. One of the mages, spitting up his own blood, screaming in terror that this can't possibly be happening. It is indeed an uncontrollable transformation into a beast that was not known about, exclaimed the other magician. But the first one calmed him down and ordered him to prepare a flame of sulfur and saltpeter. You can't do that. It's raining all over the place, his partner corrected. Even in beast form, it's not above frightening. They could pull out a win. Powerful wolf paws with claws landed on the wet sidewalk. The tiles cracked beneath them. They condemned themselves to death. The huge white she-wolf was tearing in metal. Her roar alone made the blood run cold. She simply evoked an animal fear in her foes. Kate looked down on her mistress. It was the first time she'd seen her in this beastly form. Powerful, dangerous, and ruthless. Trying to see and understand how Miss G did it. Controlled transformation. It's a decisive weapon in a fight. This strength is the goal of all hunters. Ji Jixue will be able to show all hunters a whole new way of life. But Kate further reflects that it's all thanks to the help of that man from the bookstore on 23rd Street. Who he is, what else he's capable of. What his goals are, those are the questions she asks. Suddenly, Max interrupted her train of thought. He said, "Don't think like that," and said, "I need to focus on more important things. They must accompany their mistress to help her after sharing the glory. It is their duty." Kate agreed with Max. There was no need to be distracted by extraneous thoughts during a fight. Max shouted again to her to go continue the battle. The fight was not yet won. The victory was yet to be claimed. The three mages gathered their strength together and activated the flame spell. With their staffs, instead of pointing flames straight at the white she-wolf, hoping they'd burn her. Hunter's blood is afraid of fire, but that's what they were counting on. The flames hit right against the white she-wolf's hide. There was flame heat and smoke everywhere. The smoke cleared and the she-wolf appeared almost unharmed, not a trace of damage, though the mages had intended it to burn. It was the fire attack that made her even angrier. She showed her beastly grin and began to growl loudly. Reflected fire from the white she-wolf's hide. The attack hit the building, destroying the entire first floor with windows. She stood in the middle of the dissipating smoke. Her eyes burned like red rubies. She was unfazed and calm. Then it opened its mouth as it bared its blade-sharp teeth. A golden disc appeared on her in the sky and began to hit her with bright yellow-colored energy. The impact shackled her. Last chance for the magicians. They cast their most powerful spell, crossed their sorcerer's staffs, combined the fire energy into one energy stream and directed it at the white she-wolf. It was definitely meant to strike and destroy her. She felt a terrible pain clenching her teeth. The spell was very strong indeed. The magicians really knew what they had to do. At the last minute, Max and Kate destroyed one of them. The spell was out of control. The balance of power was broken. There was a terrible explosion. Max and Kate thought their mistress was dead. After an explosion of that magnitude, there was hardly anyone left alive. There were senior mages standing upstairs, watching the battle. One said that someone was definitely helping her. Hunter transformation control. It's a surprise to him. This is a serious trump card. Even Frank Wilde can't do anything against it. The elder mage didn't know there was such a person in the city. They followed Frank. They knew he was on 23rd Street. They have an agent in the secret tower. He's the one who gave them the information. The handyman says he hasn't seen Frank Wilde yet. The chief mage tells his handmaiden to be sure to meet him. He is interrupted by a hunter, a white she-wolf, who breaks through the chief magician's protective field. He turns back in bewilderment, and for the first second he can't understand what has happened. The barrier is broken and she leaps at him. The devil is up a tree and doesn't notice. A sleep beast in the wolf form of a famous traveler in space and time. How did she even manage to find the coordinates of the head mage for her spatial jump? The white she-wolf literally knocked him to the ground and pressed his weight against the chief mage. A column of dust rose up, and she grabbed his hand and started to chew on it. Blood flew in all directions. In horror and terrible pain, the chief mage asked for the help of his assistant, Ui. He realized that he was finished. Ui concentrated, gathered his strength together. A violent cracking sound was heard. He cast a powerful dizziness flicker technique spell. Just a few words. Miss G in the white she-wolf's body realized something had gone wrong. A powerful spell using the honed language of a magician. This technique is only available to enlightened dark magicians. It's bad enough she's paralyzed and can't move at all. Ui strikes her hard and rolls her off her feet, rolling her over onto her back, pulling out his knife to slit her throat. He makes an attempt to make one precise thrust with his blade. The white she-wolf activates her steely will at the last moment. She can't take a blow from the enemy's blade. She took a leap and lightning fast ripped the head mage's arm off in a leap. It happened in a split second. He gritted his teeth in convulsion. The pain was just hell unbearable. In an instant, he lost his arm. Suddenly the white she-wolf saw a dark purple glow above her. What it was, she couldn't figure out the first time. Ui raised his staff, and high above him, a black and purple blob of extremely powerful energy appeared. The spell was simply murderous. The flame spell rotted the sun. It didn't leave any chance for the white she-wolf. It would surely destroy her. Ji Jixue in the white she-wolf's body realized that it was urgent to escape. This is the end. Run no matter what she can't stand. No matter how deformed her body was, she had to make a forced leap by all means. The spell rays of the rotting sun were about to catch up with her and she began her teleportation. Blood spurted from her mouth as she teleported. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared. Ui quickly ran up to his mentor and asked if he was okay. Chief Mage Harris, sitting on the wet paving stones, with his arm torn off and a bloody stump in its place, said he was fine. Looks like the owner of the 23rd Street bookstore is a lot stronger than expected. And the other arm begins to grow sharply from Harris's shoulder. That was impressive. Ui is asking her teacher. It's like he said that her power is the ability to move through time and space. Harris replied that that wasn't quite true. He reached for the extra hand and gripped it tightly. Ji Jixue can use Ryan's soul to gain access to his investigative network. She was able to learn the location of her opponents. I dispelled all the spells linked to her soul. With a swift movement, Harris rips out her extra arm, and in return, black blood flows. He is becoming more and more interested in this power unknown. Unfortunately, there are so many things to do, and so little time. He asks his assistant to look at one thing. A ghost egg appears in his hand, with a spark inside. He asks his student what he thinks will come out of him, who might come out of him. Yui replied that maybe it was a beast from dreams. No, he said to his assistant. He was wrong. Harris, chortling evilly and smiling, said that a deity would hatch from this egg. Lin-Ji is checking the front door of the store. Whether it's well closed, it's getting late. The store is closed. It's time to rest. On the book table there is a stack of books and a pen and inkwell. The stack of books must have been tired, and the inkwell is not closed, so the ink could dry up. The bookstore owner slowly climbs the stairs and asks himself the question that he doesn't know how long this rain will last. As soon as it's over, he'll go shopping for supplies for the store. Opens the door to his bedroom and walks in. Takes a hammer and a nail and drives it into the wall. A few blows. The hole should not be too large. The picture here will not hang on this nail. He hung a dream catcher on it. Frank's handiwork, impressive. The piece itself is unparalleled, even if you ignore the wishful thinking that went into it. The gargoyle was Frank's too, but he's very skillful. He's got good hands. Well, we can talk to him about it next time he comes by. But now it's time for a nap, Lin-Ji thought. It had not been an easy day. As he drifted off to sleep, the young man wished himself good dreams, hoping that Frank's gift would really work. Slowly, Lin-Ji's eyes close. He drifts off to sleep rather quickly. He closed his eyes and fell asleep, wrapped in a dark blanket. The dream catcher glowed bright green, right above the young boy's bed. He began to release small particles of light into the dark space of the room. Lin-Ji's hand didn't feel anything. Could it really be the snow? He stood tall in his white pajamas and snowflakes swirled around him. He couldn't tell if he was dreaming or if it was all happening. He walks barefoot in the snow, taking one step at a time. But one feature of it really surprises me. Somehow it's not cold at all, and the falling snow is like fine ashes. It is even on the contrary. This ash is warm. Though, unsurprisingly, it's a dream that what you haven't paid attention to will surprise you. Lin-Ji saw something in front of him. It wasn't something that struck him like lightning. His eyes opened wide. He was looking at a big green tree covered in ash. But from the outside, it looks like it's covered in snow. And this tree is standing in the middle of a snowy landscape. It looks really beautiful. It's incredible. Lin-Ji catches himself thinking that there can't really be such a big tree. Unless it's in a dream. After all, it wriggles like a snake, as if the blood vessels lining its skeleton are almost covering the sky and the sun. Suddenly, against the background of the tree, he noticed something. Silver strands of someone's hair stood out. It was a girl of extraordinary beauty, perfectly dressed with angelic facial features. She was leaning back against a tree post with her eyes closed. Lin-Ji looked at her and saw that she was asleep. She was like Sleeping Beauty. Looking at her at that moment, a snippet of a melody surfaced in the guy's heart. He had heard it somewhere. She stands in the silver dress with her back to him in the center hall of the castle, which is carved into the wood itself. Hands place a royal crown on her head and speak the words of the coronation of the King of the Cold North, with a crown of snow. Lin-Ji sighs and realizes that this is an incomparable sight. The scenery is beautiful. The enchanted world of dreams. It's like a child's fairy tale. Frank wasn't fooled, and the boy saw a beautiful flower growing in the middle of a snowy field. He smelled the flower and concluded that it was a lovely fragrance, exquisite, refreshing, at the same time quite simple. He looked closely at this flower and saw particles of light flying off its petals. He inhaled its scent over and over again. It was impossible to inhale. It's hardly something you can find in the real world, except in the world of dreams. Like that flower you can't look at, but it can't be real. I guess that's what conscious dreaming is. A rare ability and gift. In this state, one is able to think clearly and reason clearly, and with a little practice to distinguish his feelings from reality. It's a beautiful place. Lin-Ji reasoned that Frank's gift, the Dreamcatcher, has a psychological property. Together with Frank's speech, it can create the dream. This explanation is scientific and suits the young boy as a man with common sense. He gazes at the flower again and tries to see its details. And then he looks at a beautiful sleeping girl. If it's his dream, he can do whatever he wants in it. But in a dream, there have to be some boundaries. It's a separate world after all, where it begins and where it ends. He was eerily curious as to why he had dreamed of such a beautiful girl. And as far as he knew, people couldn't have such exact looks in a dream while being complete strangers in reality. There's something to it. Well, to be fair, all Chinese people like white hair. It's often a recognizable trait, so it's an essential attribute of Chinese beauty. After all, it's just a dream. Anything could happen here. Anything at all. Lin-Ji walked closer to the girl and decided to take a closer look at her. After all, she was extremely beautiful and pleasing to the eyes. A silver tiara adorned her forehead's silver dress, beautiful facial features, snow-white skin, a black rhomboid ornament around her neck, and silky white hair. Lin-Ji felt a little embarrassed. It's just like a work of art. You could paint pictures of her. For lack of other words, this girl's appearance was just perfect. If it's all in a dream, the guy's got a lot of nerve. He took the flower he had in his hand and decorated her hair. It was an offering for a charming stranger, though she herself is beautiful as a flower without this offering. This kind of trespassing makes vague actions so exhilarating that you just can't contain yourself in your hands. But if it's all a dream, it won't be. A red blush of embarrassment covered his face. Suddenly, the girl opened her eyes. They were a beautiful violet color, so pure like gemstones. And then he bounced away from her like a scalded man. She woke up and got to her feet at her full height. She was covered in pink gems, which played brightly in the sun. Linji couldn't make out when she was lying down, but when she stood up, she was at least 2 meters tall. It was definitely a dream, but it was impossible to meet such a dream in reality. She was silent and looked at the boy with her expressive eyes. Suddenly, she spoke to him and asked Linji who he was. Yes, the girl was truly gorgeous. There was no flaw in her. The beauty was indescribable, and she asked him the question first. He was very surprised at this, but not embarrassed. They say that people who meet in dreams are the embodiment of our subconscious mind. Linji wondered if that was true. Judging by this beauty, his subconsciousness was excellent, at least in appearance. Dialogue with your own subconscious mind is a rare experience indeed. A young guy told a girl that he was a person from a dream. She squinted a little and said she was in a dream. Well, of course she's the person from the dream. The young guy is never ceasing to be amazed and impressed by everything that is happening. The girl realizes herself and realizes she's in a dream. Such a mystical projection is worthy of a bookstore owner's subconscious. Linji replied to her that she had the right idea, and the answer is true. And now he asks a beautiful stranger a question. Who she is. And yes, the answer is human, and sleep is no longer accepted. Actually, because this is Linji's dream, it seems that he has exposed his true essence a bit. But he didn't expect it to be in the form of a beautiful girl. The girl smiled, her lips pink like the coral of the sea. Her name is Bayin. That's what she called herself. The young boy interjected, "Is it really just a name? It's nothing else." She slyly winked at Linji and said that at least it was a truthful answer. Now it was her turn to ask faithfully, and she approached the young man. Yes, he thought. Suddenly he dropped the initiative of the conversation from his hands, and she counterattacked. Things are not important. This needs to be rectified urgently. She told Linji with her eyes closed that she had been here for a very long time, and points her finger at the tree. She's been here so long she's forgotten the meaning of the word time. Pointing to his heart, Bayin says, "Definitely here is a beautiful place. It is very beautiful here, and it seems a little too quiet. There's just no sound. The tree-covered landscape is snowy. The flowers are beautiful, and an eternal silence like a dead silence." She asked Linji he could describe this feeling, what it might be called. Linji pondered for a moment. He had read many books and seen many stories on the book pages, but only one word came to his mind. It's a lot like loneliness. And then he decided to dig a little deeper for himself. It seemed very suspicious. This dream doesn't seem to fit his preferences. It's too perfect. On this romantic hill from a children's fairy tale, he uses his best work to help this nice girl break the deadlock. It's a gift, a daily relaxing hobby you just can't pass up. As they say, help others to please yourself and your ancestors will not deceive you. He started looking at these pajamas and they look very, very sloppy. If these were his everyday clothes, that would be very nice. And then his pajamas slowly begin to transform into a gorgeous black suit. And in an instant, the pajamas became a luxurious black suit. Yes, it was very spectacular. Such a transformation, even in my own dreams. Linji thought, and really, since this is a conscious dream, and it's his dream, he can change reality with his imagination. Indeed, if it is not real, there is no need to be cautious at all. He extends his hand to Bai Yin with a suggestion. If she doesn't mind, she'd like to sit down and have a little chat. A heart-to-heart. The young man's Vita was impeccable. Dark suit, white gloves. This gesture made Bai Yin really like it. She smiled sincerely at Ding Jie, but still remained silent. She cautiously held out her dainty, fragile hand to him. It's the sensation of her touch, cool and soft. He was a little surprised at that, and embarrassed at the same time. Even though it was quite warm around him, the girl's hand was cold. They sat down in a flower meadow in front of a tree, and so we need to find out what the situation is. Linji asked the girl, was she always alone in this place of dreaming? Was it always like this, or could there be someone else? Bayin replied that no one could ever come in here. No one has ever entered. It's like this dream world is like a beautiful prison. There's no guards, there's silence, and you're alone. There's no escape. She continued that Linji was the first to set foot here. Who came here? Though I wonder how she knew no one could have gotten in here. The young boy looked at Bayin with disbelief, but the story looked a lot like Rapunzel. Although Rapunzel had longer hair, but she really wasn't that pretty. Long living in a beautiful flower garden, she was always alone. Eternal sleep, turns out this is her life. It really is a fairy tale. Linji thought for a moment. It was a pity that it was only a dream. Just a dream after all. Even if it was a conscious dream. Even if he understands the problem, there is no solution for her. And he can't help her. He told Bai-yin that the feelings that plague her are lack of communication and loneliness. Her face got really pissed off and upset. Social deficit because she's always been alone, and no one could understand her, because there was no one, and loneliness because there are no new experiences, because everything is monotonous, there's no focus. Bai-yin said thoughts are the source of pain. Thoughts are afraid of her. At that, her beautiful eyes became so sad and sorrowful. Linji realized that the reason was because of the thoughts, and not understanding from the beginning. There was a philosopher in her image. We should get down to business. He told the girl that he had once heard such an expression somewhere. When people think God laughs, it's a kind of man assumes the Lord God disposes. Well, we don't need to go into the meaning of that phrase. It's not that simple, and not everyone can understand it. It seems to me that if God sees the reflection of such a fabulous beauty, the smile he will show will be incredibly warm. She's very good looking after all. Her pink eyes glistened with curiosity, they were so pure, so sincere, and her rosy cheeks added to the attractiveness of her face. Linji said that with such a thought to ponder will not be so painful, there is a small understanding with God without words. The young lad's gaze never left the girl. He enjoyed her aesthetic beauty. Then he laughed and asked Bai-yin if she thought such a thought would be too romantic. Bai-yin was embarrassed and said that this kind of thinking was really like what a romantic would say. And she liked it as well, as the naked eye could see. Now Bai-yin sees that Linji is an incorrigible romantic, but it's probably in that manner that he can have a conversation with this beautiful girl here, and he can understand her. Bai-yin said that if he appeared in this dream, it means that he understands her well. His thoughts are becoming more elevated. Linji Sam was a little embarrassed. So this is how philosophers praise people. It's a good listen, it's like honey on the ears. So Bai-yin recognizes him, that's very good. He takes her fragile hand in his palms and asks one favor. He pushes her and tells her it's his most urgent wish. And he's so afraid of rejection that she's just lost it. And then she's out of sight, and her clear eyes light up. Please tell me, and she asks with a pleading voice. Linji asks her, hopefully if she can, to be his friend, the one and only. All around in the pink glow and yellow stars, it's so romantic. She didn't quite understand what they wanted her to do, but she had a favorable look in her eyes, and approving. When confronted with someone who's withdrawn, it's best not to let your partner take the lead. It's axiomatic. Because of its inertia and thinking, it will immediately refuse subconsciously. Unfortunately, it is a fact proven by science. And Linji needs to stop her from doing that. Bai-yin, she questioningly interrogated the young guy, friend in the sense of friend. Yes, it's exactly the same, even though it's beautiful here. She's looking at the same scenery. Well, it gets boring sooner or later. And if you have a friend, you won't be so lonely alone. It's more fun when you're alone. For some reason, he's always thinking about book recommendations. I guess he's got a bit of a businessman streak in him. The books we're talking about right now are unreal. And even though he's not at the store right now, but he'll try to reconstruct the book from memory. The Grimm brothers' fairy tales are a beautiful thing. The classic is one of the best fairy tale books ever. It's just incredible to read it. He calmly unfolds the book midway, but for now remains silent. Then he slammed the book shut, it made such a queer sound. And he holds out this book to Bai-yin, and asks her to take it. This gift to her is a sign of first meeting and getting to know her. It's a gift for a friend. That's the custom. She looks at this book with her calm, serene eyes, and then holds out his hands in gratitude and accepts this gift from Linji. She holds this book to her heart, and says it's been so long since anyone's given her anything. No gifts, and how it's been so long since she's had people who just want to talk to her. She looked at her empty hand. She realized she had nothing to offer her new friend. She told the young man that she had no gifts for him, unfortunately. But there is fruit on this tree and honey in these flowers. If he wishes, he can have them. It will be as her return gift for the book. Linji looked up and thought, yes, indeed, he didn't notice them. These fruits, I wonder how tasty they are. And Vitya, this tree has indeed had golden-colored fruit from the very beginning. How unusual. Thinking about the thank you gift this tree seems to him. He reaches out his hand, he realizes he won't reach. It's completely useless. And there's nothing special about the colors either. After all, a unique experience needs a little something rare. He cautiously asked Bai-yin, these fruits can be eaten right away. Although if you are in a conscious dream, why would you want to eat anything? Bai-yin gave a friendly smile and said, yes, of course you can eat them, and pointed her exquisite finger at one of them. Immediately, this golden-colored fruit fell into Linji's hands. It was very unexpected and beautiful. It glowed like a little sunshine. A young guy was looking closely at a fruit that looks very much like an apple. The realization is just fantastic, so perfect as if from a picture. I wonder if it looks so good, but what it will taste like. I hope it tastes as good as it looks. Linji took a bite of his own. Crunchy and sweet, and there weren't even any bones. Yeah, it almost looks like an apple fruit. I guess the flavor is taken from reality. At least that's the kind of apple he tasted. Bayan asked the young boy how he tasted what he tasted. Linji wrinkled his nose pleasantly and said he liked it very much. Very sweet. Suddenly the picture began to change, and there was a sudden hissing in his ears. Everything started to crack. The world around me began to break into pieces just like a mirror, or glass. He catches himself wondering if he's waking up, but so little time has passed. Feeling touch in the dream world has no value either. What to add them to? That's right, nothing. It's an unreal experience. Linji tells Bayin that he doesn't really feel like it, but has to go. It's time. And he holds out his hand to her. She puts her hand in his palm. She remains silent, but there is pleasure and joy in her face. She hugs him. The entire dream world around her cracks and breaks into pieces. He stares intently into her eyes. Her hair blows in the wind. She bites his ear lightly, and hoping that the next night, smiling playfully and looking at him with the predatory eyes of a seductress. Their gazes met, like a magnet. It's impossible to look away, left or right. We'll meet again in a dream. And Linjia disappears. Disappears. Bayin is left alone, and the fairy world of beautiful dreams continues to crumble and break into pieces.